Mr. Chair, do you mind if we do the moving out of executive session while we're waiting for everyone to come back?
Yep, go for it.
Okay, thank you. Commissioners, this is Assistant Attorney General Kyle Davenport, where we have concluded the executive session for the purpose of discussing legal advice regarding procedure and options for the KPK enforcement matter. Mr. Chair, I invite you to encourage a motion to exit executive session.
So encouraged.
So moved.
Second.
A motion to leave executive session by Commissioner Cross, seconded by Commissioner Messner. All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
And I would note for the record that there were no votes taken and no decisions made in the course of the executive session we just had.
Correct. And there were no votes to not leave executive session, so we can consider ourselves out of executive session and back into the general meeting. Mr. Meese, good to see you. Do you know what happened to your lawyer?
I don't, but would presume he's watching, but I can certainly text him now to make sure he joins.
And Kevin too, I guess.
Mr. Chair, I'm bringing Mr. Jacobson, and they went back into the attendee list. So give me a moment, I'll bring them back in as panelists.
All present and accounted for, Mr. Chair.
All right. So the commissioners are here, at least the counsel for both staff and KPK is here. We have concluded the presentation of the update as was scheduled for today, October 19th. We held an executive session. We made no decisions, and we are back in the main session. I believe the next step, if we so choose to do so, would be, does any commissioner have questions for either the KPK and its panel or staff? All right, seeing no questions, I'm going to ramble a little bit. This is in terms of providing at least my perspective on next steps in this matter. About a year ago, we entered into, where we found KPK liable. We found a pattern of violations. We assessed a penalty, and then we entered into a compliance plan agreement that was a strategic step to allow KPK to not have to pay all the penalties up front, but to spend a fair amount of time identifying a path toward compliance with our rules and getting the various denoted locations that were found out of compliance into compliance. Procedurally, we held a meeting in May of 2022, and at that time, we made a determination that there was concern about whether KPK was taking all the steps necessary to get into compliance. We held a hearing in June of this year, and at that hearing, or following that hearing, there was discussion amongst commissioners. And while I think there was concern about whether KPK was taking the appropriate steps to get into compliance, a majority of us agreed that it was too soon to make a determination of whether KPK was in substantial compliance with the compliance plan agreement. It is complex, it's got a lot of moving parts. And so there was a determination in June that we would schedule two meetings. One was for today, in which we were to receive an update. We've now received that update. And then the second hearing that was scheduled for January 20th, I believe. And at that hearing, KPK is to present its case as to whether and how it is in substantial compliance with the compliance plan agreement. Now, I would note that the compliance plan agreement is a multi-year agreement. So it's not that you are to establish that you have made compliance, substantial compliance with everything, but there are certain things that are supposed to have occurred by January 20th, and those things are the matters that will be the basis of that hearing on January 20th. And Mr. Jacobs, you raised earlier today concerns about the commission taking action today, and that you would, have some due process concerns. I'm just putting you on notice that this commissioner, at least, is informing you that January 20th is the date that you need to be prepared on behalf of your client to establish substantial compliance with the things within the compliance plan agreement that you need to be complying with at that time. So I'm not going to be interested in you feeling not being made aware of what it is that needs to be established at that hearing. I would like to direct the parties, and Ms. Larson, if you could show up, I would like you to assign this matter to a hearing officer, and that's not me. I'm a commissioner at this point, but assign it to Elias or John or somebody, so that the hearing officer can appropriately tee this matter up for the January 20th hearing with identified witnesses and all the above, right? Is that okay that if we can do that?
Yes, most certainly. And we'll have hearing officer Peskin continue through with this matter. He was the hearing officer assigned to this docket initially, so he'll continue in that capacity.
So thank you. And in the continued rumblings from me on this matter, I'm letting all the other stakeholders that are listening in and wondering, whether, why, and to what extent we're not taking action today. It's because it's not timely. We made an earlier determination that we needed to give KPK. We created a complex compliance plan agreement, and we made an earlier determination that they deserved a year to show that they could come into compliance, and that year would be the January hearing date. But at the January hearing date, we will be making determinations, and it would be great if we're able to make a determination of substantial compliance, because but if after hearing the evidence and testimony, we are in a position in which a majority of us don't find them in substantial compliance, then we have all the tools available for whatever action the commission believes is necessary. And I'm not prejudging anything here. I'm just letting everybody know what the process is, because there's a lot of attention on this matter. So having said that, Mr. Jacobs, before I recognize you, I know you got your hand up. To my fellow commissioners, I rambled there a bit. Are you guys all comfortable with where we are today and the process moving forward as I have articulated it? Commissioner Messner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate your thoughts on that and the conclusions that you came up with. I do also agree that it was clear after the June meeting that there was to be an update, and then there was to be a compliance determination on January 20th. That was the decision that was made at the June hearing. And that is what I think needs to occur moving forward. I've also heard some pretty disturbing things today. And I really appreciate staff's continued work on this in their attempts to work with KPK to try to ensure the protection of public health, safety, welfare, the environment, and wildlife resources. With that, I would like to, at least from this commissioner, and I'm sure it's true of the other commissioners, ensure that staff understands that they should feel empowered to utilize every rule available to them to ensure the protection of public health, safety, welfare, the environment, and wildlife resources, including the utilization of 901A and cease and desist orders, should there be specific situations that need addressed between now and January 20th. But I agree with your determination, Mr. Chair, on how to move forward.
Other commissioners desire to comment? Commissioner Cross?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'll just start off by saying, as everyone is aware, I was not on the commission during the June hearing, but in preparing for today, I did go back and look at previous orders and rewatch the hearings. And that is also my understanding of the January 20th hearing to demonstrate compliance. And so, you know, as you said, to the extent and how KPK wants to show that, I think is sort of up to them. I'll just also make a statement. I think we're the government and we're here to help. But I think one of the things that we heard today is a lot of finger pointing of, well, we couldn't do this because we were waiting for approval to do it. But at the same time, I was seeing a lot of demonstrations that things were not even being noticed right away. And that is very concerning to me. And so I think that in that vein of being here to help, it should not be, oh, well, until they get this form approved, we can't do anything. I think it needs to be everything possible that you guys can do to make sure that you are complying with the CPA and with the rules set forth in our regulations.
Thank you, Commissioner Cross. Anything further? I am going to give, okay, I saw both hands. Commissioner Ackerman and then Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be brief. I, like Commissioner Cross, was not part of these proceedings when they began. I did also go back and watch all of the previous hearings and review the materials. And I just wanted to clearly say that I'm alarmed. I'm alarmed at what I'm seeing. I'm alarmed at the lack of progress. I think that we have an opportunity between now and January to show significant progress. And I hope that that's the case. And I wanted to just reiterate Commissioner Messner's comment that I also want to encourage staff to use all of the tools at their disposal to ensure that public health, safety, welfare, and the environment are protected between now and January. And I wanted to go on record as saying that I support administrative actions where they are necessary and prudent. Thank you.
Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I agree with everything that's been said by my fellow commissioners today. I guess just in addition, this felt like Groundhog Day to me. I don't want January to be Groundhog Day. I really hope it's not Groundhog Day. I'm actually really concerned about things that are still left unaddressed. And it's I said last meeting, right, our last hearing, I want to give you every chance to come into compliance and show that you do have the capability, the resources, the expertise to be able to operate in Colorado. And I'm really hoping that's what you're going to be able to show us in January. And I hope that we're not going to regret that we went down this path. But I agree that today was meant, I think, based on what we put together at the last hearing, this was a check-in. So I understand that. This is what we said that we would do. But January 20th is a decision point in my mind and a deliberative point for the commission.
Okay, I think we've heard from all commissioners. Mr. Jacobs, are you understanding of sort of where commission is and the desire for the January 20th hearing? And I also would like to hear from the staffer to make sure everybody's clear about expectations.
Mr. Chair, thank you for the opportunity. Yes, I appreciate the clarification. I understand your remarks and those of the other commissioners. I do think that it was less than crystal clear following the June hearing whether or not the proceeding on January 20th would be an evidentiary hearing. You've made that very clear today. It was referred to, I think, as an update on more than one occasion in the record of the June hearing. But we will be prepared to have an evidentiary hearing to demonstrate our substantial compliance with the requirements of the CPA, and hopefully to get your agreement with that and to continue under the CPA. So we will be prepared for that hearing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jacobs. I'm glad we've clarified the record and everybody knows what the expectations are. I believe that even if we called it a check-in, I think the record, if you go back and listen to it, was pretty clear that three of us felt like there was a full years needed for your client to obtain substantial compliance. And so I think that does make sense that that's what that hearing is going to be. And we'll have Mr. Peskin help the parties establish, how that hearing is going to be run. AG Stafford.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for clarifying the commission's thoughts there. I guess had some similar confusion. I thought there were some maybe not decisions, formal decisions made, but at least discussion about pieces of the compliance plan that the commission had agreed did not have substantial compliance on KPK's part. I thought that was determined at the conclusion of the June hearing, but I see I was mistaken there. So I appreciate the clarification there. I did not have the same misunderstanding as Mr. Jacobs about the January hearing. I was under the assumption it was an evidentiary hearing as well. I would like to ask for quick clarification related to Commissioner Cross's comments about staff, or at least KPK, getting out on site and doing work. Are you, Commissioner Cross, I'm sorry to put you on the spot. Are you referencing sort of work under Form 27 or sort of site maintenance that is sort of ongoing and necessary? I think that's that would be helpful for staff to understand, because obviously staff would not want to see an operator doing work on site without an approved Form 27, doing remedial work, I guess I should clarify.
Thank you, AAG Stafford. And no, I was not intending for them to do work that has not been approved. My comments were more so, and I apologize for not being clear with it, was more so to make sure that KPK work with staff to make sure that we get Form 27s appropriately filled out and not have to go back 3 and 4 times. And hopefully the communication that's been talked about, some improvements in communication with people in neighborhoods that this is nearby. Hopefully we can have continuous improvement in communications with staff as well to make sure that those get through, but also maintenance that needs to be done. I think it's important to make sure that the steps are going to be taken and not kind of sitting back and making sure that we're waiting to make sure that everything's ready to go before any kind of action is taken. I think it's more so being affirmatively responsible and making sure that the compliance is being taken.
Thank you for that clarification. We appreciate it. I think staff also just wanted me to briefly point out that work on the Rogers was never held up as because of this sort of situation. So just to let you all know that.
Thank you. I also see that Mr. Duranlo has visualized himself. Did you have any questions for us or anything in response?
Thanks, Chair. No, it was the last discussion that Ms. Stafford had specifically to Commissioner Krause's comments there. And so just that. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, with that, I'm looking at AAG Davenport and maybe he's looking at me.
I'm sorry, Chair Robbins, one final thing.
Oh, go ahead.
Will the Thursday meetings continue forward? Staff just wants one clarification on that as well.
Why don't, now I'm gonna make an audible. Let's not do tomorrow because we've all been busy for today. Let's meet next Thursday, and then let's have the beginning of that meeting be a discussion about the prudence of continued meetings, if that's fair. And with that being the case, Ms. Stafford, Mr. Jacobs, if you want to join us, please feel free to. I don't care. So we'll
Thank you.
meet, not tomorrow, meet next Thursday, and then determine amongst ourselves whether continued meetings make sense. And thanks, Commissioner McGowan.
Sorry, but are the Thursday meetings, were they a requirement of what we voted on when we said, here's what we need to see for compliance? And sorry, I just,
It was,
so can we just change it without voting, or do we need to vote to say you don't have to meet every once weekly, or is it just you're gonna meet?
I think we just had a discussion, and I think I volunteered myself that I would meet with the parties once a week just to kind of facilitate communication. And so I think if both parties and myself think those are going to continue, we'll do it. If everybody's sort of in agreement that those are, making matters worse, then we won't. And I don't think we need to do anything. All right, AG Davenport, did you have anything further? You've listened to all this. It's been a bit choppy, but are you comfortable that we've provided appropriate direction for the next 3 months and the January 20th hearing?
Mr. Chair, as long as the parties are clear, and it sounds like they are, I don't have anything further to add.
Okay. All right, very good. Let us be done then with the docket 2011-00261.
Mr. Chair, I think Mr. Meese was trying to get your attention.
Oh, Mr. Meese. Sorry, I
Thank you.
didn't see you.
Thank
I was
you.
reading.
Mr. Chair and Commissioner McGowan. I just want to share too, or at least before we exit, just real quick, it would be extremely helpful for us because progress is in the eye of the beholder. For us to have a very good understanding, and we can work through this on a Thursday meeting, if you will, but I guess for the record, it would be very good for us to have a very clear understanding, and again, communication, collaboration piece with staff to really understand what progress means so that we are all on the same page with regard to that come January. I think, it's obvious from this presentation, what we've provided and what staff is providing seems quite different. And I think that would be very helpful and productive going forward to establish kind of what the goalposts are as far as progress. As I've shared with Nikki several times, this is an elephant that we're trying to eat a bite at a time. And I want to make sure we're taking the right bites, to be quite frank. And I think that's important for all of us to understand so that we're all moving in that right direction together. And Kevin and I can focus those efforts accordingly. And I think that's imperative for us to show that progress that we're saying here. But I want to make sure we're showing the right progress that this board expects and that staff expects too. It is a big elephant. And there's a lot of work been done that's been shared. But if it's not the right work, then it doesn't go noticed. And so that's the only comment I want to make in closing, is that I hope that we can establish really what are those bites that we should be taking at this apple to show the progress that KPK needs to be making for that January meeting in particular. I appreciate the time.
Thank you. I think the only response that I would have to that, Mr. Meese, is at the end of the day, there is a written contractual agreement that your lawyers and my lawyers worked up that is the compliance plan agreement. And those are the goalposts. We have, I believe that staff has and continues to attempt to help your company meet those goalposts. And that's as you heard from Mr. Geronimo, you're 80% of the work that staff is doing on environmental matters, or his words. So I think they're still doing it, but at the end of the day, you need to meet what you contractually asked us to do. So I think we'll leave it at that. We will see you I'll see you next Thursday, and then the commissioners will see you on January 20th. And Hearing Officer Peskin is advised to start the process for the hearing on the 20th. So with that, we're done with this matter. Let's take a 10-minute break to get the next matter, docket 2107-00115, to get all those people into the room. And then, commissioners, I think we're going to start with kind of procedurally, what are we going to do the rest of today versus tomorrow? So be thinking about that. And so we'll come back at 2:22. Okay. Great. I see 3 lawyers in the room. We're winning. We are taking up docket 2107-00115, a application by Crestone Peak Resources Operating LLC. And this application is petitioned by the town of Erie and the city and county of Broomfield. To the lawyers that are with us and to my fellow commissioners, this matter is set for this afternoon as well as tomorrow. And I wanted to get some sense of what's the best order of proceeding. And Ms. Larson, if you can make yourself available too, because I think you could add value to this discussion as well. First off, if we start now, it's 2:20, it's almost 2:30. Do we think we can get through everything? Number one. And number two, if not, what is an appropriate sort of breaking point? Like, do we want to, do all of the openings and take up one case in chief? I'm just looking to try to facilitate what folks think is best. Ms. Jost, I'll start with you since you bear the burden of proof here.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Much appreciated for the opening discussion on this, recognizing that we're a little bit later in the day. For purposes of, I guess, Crestone's thoughts, I don't know if you guys have a hard stop today by any means, but I guess we would potentially propose that with respect to public comments, Weld County, the town of Erie, Crestone's opening, and then Broomfield's opening, and I'm going to look as I can on Zoom to Ms. Paranos, that may be getting us through today. I'm wondering, because the case in chief that Crestone will present is around 70 to 75 minutes of our 2 hours. And so I would hate to get through maybe either a quarter or 3/4 of it and then break in a part that may not make sense to pick up tomorrow morning. Obviously, we will do whatever the commission wants and as it pleases the commission to proceed. But that's where my thoughts lie with respect to potentially use of time today.
Okay, Ms. Paranos, good morning or good afternoon. Good to see you again. Do you want to weigh in on this procedural discussion?
Sure. Thank you so much, Chairman Robbins. So we are happy to go as long as necessary today. If it's possible to go past 5 o'clock, all of our witnesses are available to go past 5 o'clock. If it's not possible to go past 5 o'clock, I guess I would say we're also happy to try and get through as much testimony today as possible. I don't have, I think we have 1 hour in total, and my opening plus our initial presentation, when we timed it, was a little bit over 30 minutes. So to the extent that that helps people figure out how long we might need to get through testimony today, that's our estimate of our time.
Mr. Chair, if I may just add one thing, Mr. Maxey is with us at the moment. I know he has other engagements this afternoon, so I'm not quite sure when his hard stop is to no longer participate in today's meeting. He does have someone else in his organization that's able to present on behalf of Weld County, but I just wanted to note that as well. And if by chance Mr. Maxey is able to let us know now what his hard stop is, that could at least help us a little bit.
We're going to hear from him first anyway. just in order, Mr. Sullivan, did you have anything to add?
Chairman Robbins, no, not at this time. I mean, Erie's been allocated 15 minutes, so
Yeah.
we should be able to get our opening statement done this afternoon.
Okay. And fellow commissioners, does anyone have hard stops today? All right, I'm seeing no hard stops. Why don't we do this? Let's pretend like we're going to do as much as we can, and let's go ahead and get started. We'll do public comment, Weld County, we'll do the openings. We'll kind of check where we're at that point. I agree with you, Ms. Jost. I'd rather you do it, you do all of yours and not get stuck in the middle. But let's just see where we are at that point in time. Is that fair?
That sounds excellent, Chair. Thank you.
Okay. To begin with, I believe we're going to hear from one public commenter. Is that right, Ms. Larson?
It is Ms. Bear, and I'm just wondering, I'm not sure if Mr. Maxey is able to hang on for about 5 minutes while we transition to Ms. Bear, or if we may take Mr. Maxey's comment first and then take up.
We can do Maxey first right now. That's fine.
Okay. Mr. Maxey just said he's good to listen to the public comment.
Okay. And let's follow the normal order procedure and take public comment. Ms. Bear, good afternoon. Glad you are with us. Just want to establish the record here. You are a trustee for the town of Erie, is that right?
Correct, yep.
And
But
you're
I
not
am
testifying as a trustee, you're testifying as an individual.
That's right, correct. I'm testifying on behalf of myself.
Great, go for it. Look
All
forward to
right, thank you. Good afternoon. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to you today. I've addressed this commission many times over the years to share my family's impact stories. However, I haven't been before the commission since I was elected to the town of Erie's Board of Trustees. Later today, you'll hear from the town staff and our legal counsel, and I'm here today speaking to you representing myself as an impacted resident. The town of Erie has been volunteered as a sacrificial population for years, from the coal mining era to the boom and bust of conventional and unconventional oil and gas development. You need only to drive around our neighborhoods to see the proximity. Come on over to my house and I'll make you a cup of tea and we can look at the view from my kitchen window. State law has begun to recognize this historical environmental injustice with House Bill 1266 and the creation of the Environmental Justice Action Task Force that lives under the CDPHE. This task force will make recommendations to the legislature and the governor's office about how to begin to recognize and address the historical injustices in our state's energy policies. These recommendations will be applied broadly to departments and entities statewide to account for and begin to reverse impacts suffered by disproportionately impacted communities. In June, the CDPHE launched the EnviroScreen Map, which is a tool to help identify disproportionately impacted communities. Using this tool, my community in Erie, as well as our neighbors to the east in Dacono, have a score of 80, meaning that we suffer more environmental impacts than 80% of other Colorado counties. If we change the metric to account for air toxics or proximity to oil and gas, our score is 100. In this commission's mission change rulemaking, it was expressly stated that ensuring environmental justice for disproportionately impacted communities was a priority, and that these were Colorado's first ever rules to be adopted that incorporate environmental justice as a consideration in facility siting. While the 300 series rulemaking recognized that cumulative impacts do indeed exist, it fell short of quantifying those impacts or giving this commission a method to enforce or apply those cumulative impacts in the decision-making process for approval or denial of permits. This commission has been asked to consider a cumulative impacts rulemaking, which has been added to your agenda in December. I'm asking that this commission refrain from approving any proximate permits, including Casa East, until you have the tools to account for the impacts we already suffer and the historical environmental injustice that has been leveled on us as a disproportionately impacted community, in line with the mission of the COGCC. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bear. Does anyone have questions? All right, seeing no questions, thank you again for appearing before us. We do appreciate it. All right, we will now recognize Jason Maxey. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Chair Robbins and fellow commissioners, staff. Thank you very much for the time that we're allocated to spend and for allowing Weld County to continue to be a part of the process. That's one thing that that I advocate heavily for, both our involvement in your process and the COGCC's involvement in our process, along with other relevant agencies that can provide comments on our permitting process. It all plays into good land use. It all plays into good communication, a good partnership between all entities. So I appreciate that. I'm going to go through some standard comments and I'll try to keep them as brief as I can regarding this location. Might add a few comments just off the cuff, but I don't want to delve into any items that are not relative to land use. And then, as Ms. Larson said, I am currently at another meeting down in Denver. And so if there's any questions that come up after I give these initial comments, basically at 2:40 is going to be kind of my hard stop that I need to go do another presentation. So my apologies on that. We being Weld County submitted comments on the COGCC Form 2A on June 21st, 2022. For Weld County, case number 1041 WOGLA 20-0018 has been assigned to this location. On February 12th of 2020, a pre-application meeting was held to discuss Crestone Peak Resources site analysis on the proposed location, as well as some other options. This meeting was between Crestone and the Oil and Gas Department of Weld County. It's important to note, as many of you probably picked up on from the date, that we did not have the pre-application requirement in place February 12th of 2020, meaning that the COGCC was not a part of that meeting, nor was CPW. However, I'll make an additional comment on that in just a minute for the referral piece of this. Even though the pre-application meeting was not a requirement of Weld County at that time, we still chose to have a pre-application meeting with Crestone so that we could better understand their analysis of the area and get a better understanding of what we may see for the subsequent application to follow. So even though it's not a requirement, we still do request those routinely. And this goes to show that even prior to the rule that says a pre-app was required, that we did that. Crestone Peak did submit their 1041 WOGLA application to the Oil and Gas Department on May 7th, 2020. And it's also very important to note that this application was submitted to Weld County prior to the state's new rules, which took effect January 15th of 2021, as you all know. However, the application for Weld County did include siting analysis, as you all know, as part of our process for every oil and gas location that we receive. And it included an analysis of 4 alternate sites, which were reviewed and discussed in detail with the oil and gas staff, as well as at the hearing. You all are very well familiar with our referral process, meaning that when we get an application, we send out referral requests to multiple entities. We also send out notification to surrounding homeowners as well as property owners. One very quick item to note regarding the surrounding property owner and homeowner notification was, again, at the time of this application, our rules were slightly different. We required notification to homeowners and property owners basically within 1,000 feet of the location. That distance is now 2,000 feet, as you all know. However, through documentation that we have in our file, we actually ended up sending this out a little bit further. We ended up sending it out to property owners and any homeowners that were within 1,320 feet, which is basically a quarter of a mile from the location boundaries. We also did send out referral requests, and they were sent to multiple agencies on May 14th of 2020. Now, responses were received from the CDPHE, from the Weld County Environmental Health Department, the Weld County Public Works Department, Weld County Office of Emergency Management, the Town of Erie, and the Stanley Ditch Company. All of those entities returned referral responses. The Town of Erie response received said that they have reviewed the request and find no conflicts with this application for Weld County. Responses were not received from Colorado Parks and Wildlife, from the COGCC, from the City and County of Broomfield, or the Mountain View Fire District. So I wanted to make sure that that was noted about the referrals that were sent out, because again, even though this was a couple years ago at this time, that process is still in place, and we did that at the time, and we continue to do that to try to encourage dialogue regarding any concerns regarding an application before Weld County. Commissioner Messner has pointed out that he really likes our term application or applicant for intervention. So Commissioner Messner, we did receive one application for intervention on this location. The intervention party was a company at the time. I'm not sure if today it's the same name or not, but it was a company by the name of Surprise Property Development. They were the owner of the outdoor storage facility, which has a land use permit with Weld County called a use by special review, or a USR, directly south of the parcel that the Costlet location is situated upon. The hearing officer did grant the intervention request, and we heard testimony at our hearing from Mr. Rice as well as his counsel. So that was taken into account during the hearing process at the 1041 Wogla hearing, which was held on June 25th, 2020. Now, the oil and gas hearing officer, while he considered testimony at that hearing, at the time found the application and the testimony insufficient to render a decision or to approve or deny that permit. So what he did was he ordered a continuance order, which had a return hearing date for the continued hearing on July 23rd, 2020. At the conclusion of the July 23rd hearing, the hearing officer again found the application and testimony a little bit insufficient to render a decision that day to approve or deny the permit, and subsequently issued another continuance order to the applicant to appear on October 22nd, 2020. However, at the October 22nd, 2020 hearing, the oil and gas hearing officer considered additional testimony and evidence at that meeting and found that the evidence and testimony were sufficient, and subsequently approved the 1041 Wogla permit, which again is 1041 Wogla 20-0018. A final order was recorded with our county clerk and recorder on November 3rd of 2020 and subsequently published in the Greeley Tribune as per our rules and requirements, which does create a vested property right for this permit. From a land use perspective, Weld County believes this is a good location for an oil and gas development. It is very close to other oil and gas development. It is close to other commercial types of use. In addition to the storage facility that I mentioned, there are other types of commercial uses around this area. And it's also very close to the interstate. So there's very adequate means of travel for truck traffic to not impact local roads through any towns or any other jurisdictions before they get out onto a major highway such as the interstate. So with all that being said, I do have a couple more minutes that could be taken for any type of questions before I need to go. But I do want to say Weld County would support approval of this permit. And thank you very much for the time, as always. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Maxey. We appreciate you being here with us and providing the perspective of the relevant local government. Are there questions for Mr. Maxey? Commissioner McGowan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Mr. Maxey, for being here today. I'm wondering, can you remind me, when you sent information out to folks, was this before the commission had developed a definition for approximate local government and what the definition of how they could participate in an application? I mean, is it possible that Erie said they didn't have any concerns or it didn't affect them because they wouldn't have been defined as approximate local government at that point in time and maybe didn't know what options they would have to participate in your process or ours?
Thank you, Commissioner McGowan, very much for that question. I would be speculating a little bit because, as you know, that definition is a part of your new rules. And again, they didn't take effect for close to a year after we initially got the application. And again, it was referred out in basically the middle of 2020. And if they, I don't want to just point to the town of Erie, but if anybody was relying on the definitions from the COGCC, I would have to, ask them definitively if that was the case. However, that being said, I don't believe that there would be any excuse to not participate in the Weld County process because our referral very definitively states that we have an application in front of us. You are a close proximate entity that may have information that is relevant to the permit in front of us, and we would request that you would supply us with any comments that your jurisdiction may have. And as you heard, that goes out to many jurisdictions, including ditch companies. The Stanley Ditch Company responded to our referral. So we do that, and we have done that, as you know, ever since the beginning of our WOGLA process, regardless of the version of code that we are in. So if there was any confusion about what a proximate or relevant local government is, I can't speculate to that, but I can say that Weld County has encouraged all forms of participation in the Weld County permit process since day one of our department opening up and the 1041 process being in place.
Okay, thank you. Hold on, there was another question and it's been a long day already, sorry. I'm gonna have to see if it comes back to me, but thank you. I might check in with you later after your presentation. I know what it was, sorry. I have some confusion about surface owner and agreements and whether or not there was an original and then there was a new owner, and I'm sure this is going to get cleared up later on. Was there or was there not a surface use agreement when you all heard the application?
Great question. There was not a surface use agreement in place at the time. What there was an effective lease that allowed the operator to develop minerals in this area. And under Weld County rules, we do not require a surface use agreement to be a part of the application. In fact, our code specifically states that if a surface use agreement is not in place, the operator can still continue forward with a permit under a different means or mechanism. However, we would ask for a statement from the operator whether or not they were pursuing an SUA. And going back to this hearing, again, there were 3 of them, and the SUA was a big point of discussion. And I'm sure Crestone will elaborate on this because this goes back to some new information that has probably happened in the last 2 years since Weld County approved this permit. But we reviewed the permit and operated under the lease agreement that was in place. Our county attorney was at the hearing and did say that the case could continue on and that the hearing officer could consider approval using just the lease and not having an SUA in place.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful.
You're welcome.
Other questions for Mr. Maxey? All right, Mr. Maxey, you're late for your date. Go do your thing, and we appreciate you being here with us. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Just for the record, if Miss Jennifer Teeters needs to speak, that is my staff member who will be speaking. So again, thank you for your time, and I will try to jump on after I'm done with this next meeting in case there's any questions that need to be answered at that time. Thank you.
Okay, very good. All right, we are going to proceed to the next. So I'm following the pre-hearing order, everybody, in terms of the order of play. The pre-hearing order next has the opening statement by Town of Erie. Mr. Sullivan.
Thank you, Chairman Robbins. I'm John Sullivan of Sullivan Green CV for the commissioners who do not know me. We represent the Town of Erie in this matter. Our opening statement is as follows. Erie requested to participate in this matter under Rule 507A1 as a relevant local government with legal authority over the proposed oil and gas development plan that is the subject of this matter. Erie believes it has status as a relevant local government under the applicable definition in the COGCC rules and under the amended and restated operator agreement dated November 4th, 2018 between Erie and Crestone Peak Resources. The COGCC's hearing officer issued an order granting Erie affected persons status on September 22nd, 2022 without stating whether Erie was a relevant local government or not. However, in light of the fact that Erie and Crestone agree that the best management practices contained in the operator agreement should be included as a condition of approval if the commission approves Crestone's OGDP application, the commission need not decide whether Erie is a relevant local government or not. In some of the pleadings in this case, Crestone has characterized Erie as supporting this OGDP. In the director's recommendation and the revised version, Erie is characterized as protesting this OGDP. Neither of these characterizations is accurate. Erie's interest as an affected person in this matter is to ensure that Crestone complies with the terms of the operator agreement, particularly the BMP standards included in that agreement. Erie and Crestone have stipulated that the operator agreement is admitted in this matter as Erie Exhibit A and Crestone Exhibit 12. In 2021, representatives of Erie and Crestone worked together in the submission and review of various plans and other materials required under the operator agreement. Erie reviewed Crestone's materials, identified certain omissions, and then notified Crestone of omissions on September 30th, 2021. In October and December 2021, Crestone provided additional materials to enable Erie to determine that the standards listed in the BMP Exhibit A to the operator agreement would be met, or provided letters of assurance that such standards would be met in the future. Crestone has given every indication that it intends to comply with the BMPs in the operator agreement. In a letter dated August 30th, 2022, Crestone stipulates that all BMPs applicable to the Causlades pad site under the operator agreement shall apply, and Crestone does not object to such BMPs being incorporated into any Form 2A that the Commission may approve following the hearing in this matter. Crestone and Erie have stipulated that the August 30th letter is admitted in this proceeding as Erie Exhibit C and Crestone Exhibit 13. Like others, Erie also wants to ensure that the cumulative impacts of the Causlades OGDP are mitigated in a way that protects human health, safety, and welfare of Erie's citizens, as well as the environment and wildlife, as stated in the operator agreement and consistent with the statutory revisions to the Oil and Gas Conservation Act and COGCC rules under Senate Bill 19-181. Crestone and Erie have agreed upon the terms of a stipulation in this matter, which reads as follows. If the Commission decides to approve Crestone's OGDP application, Crestone and Erie agree that the Commission should incorporate the BMP standards in the operator agreement admitted as Erie Exhibit A and Crestone Exhibit 12 as part of its approval of the OGDP in this matter. If that's all of the statement I have to make at this time, but Erie does have two witnesses available to answer questions from the Commission. One is David Frank, the Energy and Environmental Program Specialist and local government designee for the town of Erie. The second is Dresden Kinnaird, an environmental scientist and energy services division manager for CGRS, who worked with Mr. Frank in evaluating the plans and materials submitted by Crestone to the town. Their respective resumes have been stipulated for admission as Exhibit D, Erie Exhibit D, and Erie Exhibit E. And that's all I have to say.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sullivan, for the opening statement on behalf of the town of Erie. Before I move to the opening statement of Crestone, I skipped over something in the pre-hearing order. AAG Davenport, if you could show up, that would be helpful. Number 2 in the pre-hearing order said, determination if the Commission has a conflict of interest. What does that mean and how do we satisfy that issue?
Mr. Chair, that's a check-in with the commissioners in regard to whether or not there is any conflict pursuant to our rules that may preclude them from participating in this matter, or if there's any potential conflict that needs to be disclosed. So I think all you need to do at this point is just ask if any commissioner has something to disclose or needs to recuse themselves.
So asked. Seeing none, I think we've successfully dealt with pre-hearing order number 2. All right, we now will move to the opening statement by Crestone. Ms. Jost.
Great, thank you, Chair. And just for purposes of time, Ms. Larson, could you reserve 25 minutes for rebuttal and closing for Crestone?
Yes.
Great, thank you very much. Well, good afternoon, commissioners, staff, council, and members of the public. My name is Jamie Jost, and I'm the managing shareholder of Jost Energy Law. I, along with my partner, Kelsey Weslinski, represent Crestone Peak Resources Operating LLC on the Cosla East Oil and Gas Development Plan application. Crestone's primary focus for the Cosla East OGDP is to ensure that the development of and production from the OGDP and established unit is done so in a manner that protects public health, safety, and welfare, including the protection of environment and wildlife resources in accordance with this commission's legislative declaration. At the end of the hearing, Crestone believes that this commission can approve the Cosla East OGDP application because Crestone will provide substantial evidence through witness testimony, exhibits, and discussion that the Cosla East oil and gas location is protective of the public health, safety, welfare, the environment, and wildlife resources, which meets the intent and purpose of Senate Bill 19-181 and the mission change rules. That the location is thorough in its applicability of numerous best management practices from Weld County, the town of Erie, the CDPHE, the surface owner, and the COGCC to avoid, minimize, and mitigate impacts to the community and environment, including emission best management practices that will minimize the potential adverse public health impacts. That the location is in compliance with Rule 604B1 because Crestone has obtained 100% of the informed consents from the 2 residential building units within 2,000 feet of the working pad surface of the pad. That the location is also in compliance with COGCC regulations applicable to the OGDP and the oil and gas location. That the location is subject to a voluntary condition of approval requested by Crestone that provides, and I'm just going to read this verbatim, any well to be drilled and completed from the Cosla East oil and gas location shall be drilled and completed within 3 years from the date of approval of the Cosla East oil and gas development plan. If any well is not drilled and completed within that 3-year period, then Crestone will apply for a Rule 502 variance from Rule 311, seeking an extension of the expiration date of the Form 2, end quote. We believe that you'll also find that the location is inclusive of a P&A program and a commitment to remove existing wells and associated facilities to expand the existing Coslet site. It's supported by an approved Weld County WOGLA permit. You heard from Mr. Sullivan that the town of Erie and Crestone have reached a stipulation with respect to all of the BMPs that will apply from the Erie Crestone operator agreement to the Cosla East site. The location has been confirmed by the surface owner through an executed surface use agreement, and that is recommended for approval by the director. Now, with respect to some of the specifics for the Cosla East OGDP, the Cosla East OGDP is one of the earlier OGDP applications submitted under the mission change rules, as it was filed in July of 2021. The Cosla East oil and gas location is located in the southeast, northeast, and southwest northeast of Section 22, Township 1 North, Range 68 West in Weld County. As you know, Weld County is the relevant local government, and although the location is not within the town of Erie's jurisdictional boundaries, it is governed by the town of Erie operating agreement. The 1,920-acre OGDP contains an existing 1,920-acre spacing unit with 9 producing horizontal wells that were approved by this commission in 2018, and Crestone is seeking an additional 19 horizontal wells on the expanded Coslet location. As I've already stated, Crestone has obtained 100% of the informed consents from the RBU owners within 2,000 feet of the working pad surface and has also obtained an executed surface use agreement. There are no schools, no childcare centers, no high occupancy building units, no designated outdoor activity areas, no floodplains, no riparian corridors. This is also not high priority habitat, and the location is not within a disproportionately impacted community. The Coslet East location is unique in that it will produce into a pipeline gathering system that was intended to service only Crestone. Therefore, liquid stabilizations will occur at Crestone's centralized stabilization facility, which is located approximately 1 mile west of the Coslet location, not on the well pad as is common throughout the basin. In this instance, the centralized facility has the obligation to stabilize the liquids and ensure that they meet the requirements of the regional distribution system. So oil storage tanks are not required. Additionally, The gathering system was designed to include produced water takeaway via a dedicated pipeline, which is another unique component of the Coslet East development. Because of this, no produced water storage tanks are required, as the water will be transported from the production facility via pipeline to downstream water management facilities. Crestone will also file its ambient air quality plan with the CDPHE that will allow Erie, Broomfield, Dacono, and Weld to provide comment on. And Crestone will also enhance its air monitoring program with a continuous optical gas imaging that you'll hear more about during Crestone's testimony. Crestone has worked closely with various stakeholders, including the CDPHE and Weld County, and the petitioning parties in this matter as this application has progressed since its filing in July of 2021. Most notably, after almost 3 years of diligently attempting to contact the surface owner of the Coslet East oil and gas location, Ms. Juanita Brennan, Crestone was able to obtain a fully executed surface use agreement with Ms. Brennan. Ms. Brennan has withdrawn her petition and confirmed in the withdrawal that she does not object to the OGDP application. We've been in contact with Commission staff, and as a result of obtaining the executed SUA, Crestone will coordinate with staff to remove the surface owner protection bond as the noted right to construct, and will also remove the surface owner bond as one of the ALA criteria for the Coslet East location on the Form 2A after receipt of the Commission's decision on this application. Crestone publicly would like to wholeheartedly thank Ms. Brennan and her counsel, Mr. John Watson and Mr. Adam Veltri, for their invaluable time and efforts on the negotiations and execution of the surface use agreement with Crestone. Crestone has also worked closely with the town of Erie on the Coslet East oil and gas location for over a year. And as Mr. Sullivan noted in his statements, Crestone supports Erie's requested relief of including the town of Erie operator agreement BMPs on the Form 2A, and has provided the stipulation letter to the town of Erie and this commission to document that support. Crestone does not believe, and I think I heard Mr. Sullivan agree, that a determination needs to be made as to whether the town of Erie is a relevant local government or a proximate local government due to the contractual land use authority provided by the operator agreement. We think this is especially true since Crestone supported Erie as a party to this proceeding and has confirmed that the operator agreement applies to this location. Crestone has also been in discussions with the city and county of Broomfield about the Coslet East oil and gas location for quite some time. And although we're postured as a contested hearing, Crestone appreciates Broomfield's professionalism and Broomfield's council's continued collaboration to ensure that this hearing is efficient for the commission. Crestone acknowledges Broomfield's affected person status under Rule 507 and is not challenging that. But we do feel it's important for the commission to recognize that Broomfield did have the opportunity to bring its concerns with the Coslet location to Crestone, Weld County, and this commission earlier than the petition date through various avenues. The WOGLA process, where Broomfield was a referral agency but did not provide any response or comments, a request for a meeting and discussion with Crestone at any time in order to discuss Broomfield's issues with the Coslet location, and then through Commission Rule 511. Unfortunately, Broomfield did not take advantage of these available avenues, and even more concerning is that Broomfield is not seeking to add additional BMPs or COAs to this location, but to have this commission deny the OGDP application as a whole. You will hear from Crestone's witnesses that Broomfield's testimony and exhibits regarding its health survey and the corresponding perception-based impacts that stem from a primed idea that oil and gas development is the cause of such impacts should not outweigh the scientific and technical analysis that will be presented by Crestone. Crestone's cumulative impact analysis in the testimony today is based on real public data from existing air monitoring programs from 5 different parties. This includes the Broomfield Boulder Air, the Broomfield Ajax CSU party, CDPHE, Erie, and CTEH. The studies that will be referenced by Crestone's experts were conducted over a period of multiple years. They were conducted at over 10 Crestone and extraction well pads that utilize similar BMPs, and they were conducted at both the pre-production and production phases. It is Crestone's intent to show that Broomfield's perception-based health survey is not a tool that this commission should utilize to consider perceived health impacts over 2 miles away from the Coslet location, We believe that we will present substantial evidence to this commission that you may rely upon to deny Broomfield's requested relief and approve the OGDP application. To conclude, Crestone respectfully requests that this commission approve the 1,920 acre Coslet East OGDP application and allow 19 new wells to be developed from the expanded multi-well pad, along with the 9 existing producing horizontal wells from another pad within the established 1,920 acre drilling and spacing unit. Thank you, and we do look forward to presenting to you.
Thank you, Ms. Jost. At this time, we will call upon Ms. Baraños for the opening statement by the City and County of Broomfield.
Thank you, Chair Robbins. Good afternoon, Chair Robbins, members of the Commission, Director Murphy, and staff. My name is Elizabeth Baraños, and I'm here representing the City and County of Broomfield. Broomfield appreciates the opportunity to provide testimony today regarding Crestone's application to construct a 19-well unconventional oil and gas pad approximately 500 feet from its northwest border. As you know, Broomfield objects to the construction of this multi-well facility based on concerns that the hazardous air pollutants, or HAPs, from the facility, in combination with HAPs from other existing oil and gas facilities, threaten public health. We urge the Commission to deny the application as inconsistent with the Commission's charge to protect and minimize adverse impacts to public health and welfare. You will hear significant discussion today and tomorrow regarding whether the hazardous air pollutants from the proposed multi-well pad pose a threat to residents living near the well site. The parties do not agree on this issue. However, we know the following, which we believe raise sufficient concerns regarding public health threats to tilt the scales towards a denial of the application. First, we know that the proposed multi-well facility will emit hazardous air pollutants, including benzene, a known carcinogen. Crestone's cumulative impacts plan estimates the facility will emit over 600 pounds of HAPs, including 813 pounds of benzene during pre-production activities, and 1,000 pounds a year of hazardous air pollutants during production. Importantly, these estimates are based on engineering calculations that assume average emissions for equipment and activities. A large body of peer-reviewed scientific literature has demonstrated that actual measured emissions are significantly higher than estimates reported to EPA pursuant to EPA's greenhouse gas reporting program. This is largely because equipment and operations do not always work as intended. Equipment and operations can fail, leak, and malfunction, and these types of abnormal emissions are not accounted for in traditional emission factors. Congress's recent amendments to the Clean Air Act requiring EPA to update its national greenhouse gas inventory to incorporate empirical data, such as direct measurements of emissions, recognize the serious problem of underestimation. This problem is not unique to greenhouse gas emissions. It is true for estimates of the other pollutants, including hazardous air pollutants that are contained in hydrocarbons that are emitted from oil and gas facilities. Thus, we know the Coslet East facility will emit hazardous air pollutants based on Crestone's own data, yet we believe there is a high likelihood that actual HAPs will be higher than Crestone's estimates. We also know that there are 6 multi-well unconventional pads and over 300 producing vertical wells near the Coslet East pad, and that these facilities, like the proposed Coslet East facility, will emit HAPs during pre-production and production. What we don't know is how many HAPs will be emitted from these facilities, as Crestone did not estimate hazardous air pollutant emissions from the existing oil and gas facilities near the Coslet East pad, including the 6 multi-well unconventional pads in Broomfield. However, Broomfield's extensive air monitoring network has detected elevated levels of hazardous air pollutants near the 6 multi-well unconventional pads in Broomfield and in surrounding neighborhoods. The 6 multi-well pads in Broomfield are also tankless facilities drilled with electric drill rigs and operated with many of the same BMPs to reduce emissions, as Crestone proposes for the Coslet East pad. Broomfield's air monitoring findings demonstrate that even a state-of-the-art unconventional oil and gas facility emits hazardous air pollutants. Dr. Weisner, Senior Environmental Epidemiologist with Broomfield, will discuss a large scoping review of the literature on HAPs and oil and gas development that demonstrates that the production phase has the potential to emit the highest concentrations and the most varied mixtures of hazardous air pollutants over the longest time period. This is relevant as the 6 multi-well pads in Broomfield are now in the production phase. We also know that there are developed and undeveloped residential parcels near the proposed Coslet East pad and existing producing wells. Specifically, there are 10 residential parcels within 1 mile of the Coslet East facility and 639 residential parcels within 2 miles of the proposed facility. There's also a residential neighborhood within 2 miles of the proposed Coslet East facility and at least one of the multi-well unconventional pads in Broomfield. Broomfield is concerned for the health of residents living within 2 miles of the Coslet East pad and existing wells. This is based on Broomfield's extensive experience monitoring oil and gas emissions and the results of its epidemiological study conducted with researchers from the University of Colorado School of Public Health. Our study examined the link between exposure to cumulative emissions from several unconventional multi-well facilities. To the best of our knowledge, our study is the first study to date to examine the association between self-reported health symptoms and active multi-well unconventional oil and natural gas sites utilizing well-defined BMPs. As I noted, Broomfield's complex air monitoring network has detected elevated levels of HAPs near the extraction well sites in Broomfield and in residential neighborhoods. You will hear from Andrew Valdez, the former director of strategic initiatives with Broomfield, that in just 1 quarter of 2021, Broomfield's system captured 12 events that exceeded the short-term minimum risk level for benzene established by the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease for Benzene. The minimum risk level is, quote, an estimate of the daily human exposure to a hazardous substance that is likely to be without appreciable risk of adverse non-cancer health effects over a specified duration of exposure, end quote. You will also hear from Mr. Buck, CEO of Ajax Analytics, and Dr. Weisner, that a lack of recorded levels of benzene above the health-based guidelines does not mean that air quality in residential neighborhoods is healthy to breathe. As Mr. Buck will explain, monitors provide a snapshot in time of air pollutant concentrations. They do not tell us concentrations of HAPs at locations other than the location of the monitor, nor do they tell us for how long a monitored concentration persists once it moves past a sensor. Dr. Weisner will explain that there are no health-based guidelines for exposure to multiple pollutants. Health-based guidelines are for individual HAPs, such as benzene, not the cocktail of pollutants that Broomfield has identified emanating into residential neighborhoods from its 6 multi-well unconventional pads. As I noted above, Broomfield has identified a residential neighborhood that is within 2 miles of the proposed Coslet East facility and at least one of the extraction multi-well pads. The Broomfield Health Study provides evidence that adults and children living within 2 miles of extraction well sites are self-reporting health symptoms associated with the air pollutants emitted from these sites. Broomfield's health study is consistent with the findings from other peer-reviewed studies that indicate that persons living near unconventional oil and gas facilities may be at risk of developing adverse health symptoms. This commission is tasked with regulating oil and gas development and production in a manner that protects public health and welfare. Robust evaluation and analysis of the threat that cumulative emissions from existing oil and gas facilities in combination with emissions from proposed facilities may pose to public health is imperative for this commission to implement this mandate. The evidence we are presenting, both our air monitoring data and the results of our health study, demonstrate the potential for cumulative emissions from multi-well unconventional pads in and near Broomfield to threaten public health to nearby residents. We urge you to deny the proposed pad due to the threat to public health posed by the cumulative emissions from the proposed pad and existing pads. Thank you.
Thank you for that opening statement. So we are at 3:12. I think if we plow through to say 5:30, we should be able to get all of your testimony and evidence in, Ms. Jost. Does that sound fair?
Yes, Chair, I think that absolutely works. When we planned this out, it was about 70 minutes. And Ms. Pranos and I did chat before the hearing today with respect to, the allowance for cross-examination questions. And if it pleases the commission, we've agreed that each party would be able to get through the entirety of the presentation and not cross-examine the witnesses by part, but cross-examine them at the end of the presentation, just for purposes of efficiency. If you would be willing to do that, I do think we could get through our case in chief the rest of the day.
Yeah, I'm totally willing to do that. That makes a lot of sense. Do you need 5 minutes to gather all your people and get your screen share going and all that kind of stuff?
Yes, please. That would be great because we have a whole host of panelists that do need to be brought on.
Right. Let's return at 3:20. That gives you 6 minutes.
Great. Thank you so much. Chair Robbins, I believe we have everyone from the panel on.
Yeah, I was looking around. We have so many people on, I couldn't find one of my commissioners, but I now think I see everybody. So it might be helpful, Ms. Jost, if like whomever's going to be the witness is visualized as opposed to everybody, unless you're planning on calling on multiple people at one time. I just like to be able to focus on who's actually talking.
Yes, Chair, and we've planned that. We just wanted to make sure you could see everyone. And then what I'll do is when I start screen sharing, we will all go off video except for the presenter at that point.
Okay, great. And so you can confirm you've got everybody?
Yes, we do have everyone. Thank you.
All right. Well, the floor is yours, and you do have a time allocation that I know you're well aware of. One other procedural matter before we get going. I need AG Mercer to swear in the witnesses. However you would like to do that, you have the floor now, Ms. Mercer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's probably most efficient if we get all of Crestone's witnesses sworn in at the same time. So if each of you could just have your video on, raise your right hand, state your name, and that you swear to tell the truth. That way we can get started. So I'll start with, I believe Ms. Stearman is the person I see first.
Swear to tell the truth. Thank you.
Ms. Hall, could state your name and that you swear to tell the truth.
Dr. Caitlin Hall, I swear to tell the truth.
Thank you. Mr. Newhall.
Shannon Newhall, I swear to tell the truth.
Thank you. Dr. McMullen.
Dr. Tammy McMullen, I agree to, can you tell me it again?
I swear to tell the truth. Thank you, Dr. McMullen. Ms. Denzer. And you're on mute.
You're on mute. It's hard to swear if you're on mute.
My apologies. I'm Kathy Denzer and I swear to tell the truth.
Thank you. Mr. Harrington, are you also part of the panel?
Ian Harrington, I swear to tell the truth.
All right, Mr. Chair, I believe that is everybody, unless Ms. Jost tells us otherwise.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Mercer. We have one more. Mary Yeast is on, and I don't see her on video, but she is here, and she is a subject matter expert that will not be doing direct presentation. Mary, I don't know if you can hear me or not. If so, can you please come off of mute?
Ms. Yeast, I see that you're off of mute. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yeah, if you could just raise your right hand and say your name and that you swear to tell the truth.
Yes, Mary Yeast, I swear to tell the truth.
Very good. Thank you very much. Ms. Jost, I believe you are good to go.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Let me go ahead and start the screen share. just for clarity, can everyone see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Well, great. Well, we will go ahead and dive right in. So Chair, thank you very much. And again, thank you to everyone who is here to participate today and consider this application. Dan Harrington, Kathy Stearman, Dr. Tammy McMullen, and Dr. Caitlin Hall will be providing direct testimony on the Coslade OGDP application this afternoon. And we also have Kathy Denzer, Chandler Newhall, and Mary Yeast with us. Bob Bresnahan is unfortunately unable to be with us, and Mr. Harrington is prepared to address any questions that may come up with respect to the surface use agreement that Mr. Bresnahan was going to speak to. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mr. Dan Harrington for the start of the presentation.
Thank you, Jamie, and thank you to the commissioners and staff for hearing this matter today and allowing us to present our Coslade East oil and gas location. Here we just have an overview map with the Coslade East proposed pad location. It's near the intersection of Erie Parkway and I-25. A quick overview of the DSU history. This development will develop a 1920 acre DSU that was originally established by Crestone Peak in 2018. That DSU was approved at the time. Subsequent to that, we proposed, built, and drilled the original Coslade location covering the east half of section 22 and 27. The Coslade East location with its 19 wells is intended to complete development of the DSU in sections 23 and 26. The mineral story is relatively simple. Crestone holds the bulk of the leasehold in the 1920 acre DSU. Those minerals are predominantly fee with one small federal tract, and we do have a valid federal permit for the one well that will penetrate that tract. Coslade East, the Coslade East oil and gas location is the most protective location we can find to develop sections 23 and 26. There are 2 RBUs within 2,000 feet, but we do have informed consent from those RBUs. A bit of an update to the second bullet point here. We actually have an executed service use agreement as of this week. And we have no schools, child care centers, high occupancy building units, designated outdoor activity areas, public water systems, floodplains, riparian corridors, DICs, or high priority habitat nearby. Crestone respectfully requests approval from the Commission on the 1920 acre Coslade East OGDP for 19 new horizontal wells. Quick overview of the timing of development. We'll plan to construct this pad in first quarter 2023, to drill it in first and second quarter, to complete it in second and third quarter, and to have all wells online by the end of next year. It's important to note that this location is not a new site. This location will be built over the legacy vertical Coslade B battery that's circled there in red in the aerial image. That is a relatively old battery. It is a tanked facility with 2 operating wells and several wells that have already been P&A'd. If Coslade East is approved, we will scrape that facility, P&A the 2 remaining wells, and replace it with a modern tankless facility of the style seen in the photos in the lower right. We're committing to 6 P&As associated with this development. 2 of those wells are the Coslade B battery wells under the Coslade East pad expansion, and the remaining 4 are out in the development area in sections 23 and 26. The 2 Coslade wells will be P&A'd prior to construction, and the remaining 4 will be P&A'd prior to completions. Quickest history of the Coslade East oil and gas location. This was one of the first OGDPs submitted by Crestone Peak Resources. The original submittal was July 2021. That was amended several times. We did reach completeness in the second quarter of 2022. We got through our public notice period and petition period. We got our director's recommendation just 1 week ago, and here we are at our hearing date. This is evidence of our 30-day pre-application notices that was submitted to the town of Erie, city of county of Broomfield in March 2021. Dacono came in November 2021, and that was an error on our behalf, and Dacono did waive that notice period. Here we have evidence of the 7-day of notice completeness. The director approved our Form 2C on 5/23, and the notice of completeness went out to 216 interested parties 3 days later. The relevant local government is, of course, Well County. We've already heard from Mr. Maxey. Thank you, Mr. Maxey. The Well County WOGLA was submitted in March 2020, and it was approved in October 2020. This is the order approving the WOGLA. As has already been discussed, Crestone does acknowledge the town of Erie's contractual land use authority over the Casa Luz oil and gas location, despite this site being outside the city limits of Erie. We have stipulated to all operator agreement BMPs, as well as some additional BMPs requested from Erie, and you did hear from Erie earlier today to this matter. This is the stipulation letter that you've all seen with the agreement BMPs as well as the additional BMPs. And this is a list of those BMPs that we committed to the town of Erie. Here's a summary of Rule 60B1. We are within 2,000 feet of 2 RBUs. We did seek informed consent for those RBUs. And if we go to and here are the informed consent letters for both building units. Here's a quick summary of the surface owner outreach that led to the SUA. We had extensive communication attempts throughout 2019 to 2021, including email, phone, certified mail, and hand delivery of letters with both Ms. Brennan and her counsel. We actually had minimal progress until this past September, when we were contacted by Ms. Brennan's new counsel with a desire to enter into an SUA. Over the past month, we've come to terms on that SUA, and we're happy to say that was fully executed on October 17th. Thank you to Ms. Brennan and her counsel for this. That SUA has been provided to COGC staff. A summary of the alternative location analysis work that was done for the Casa Luz location is listed here. The original OGDP went in with 4 alternative locations. We added 2 a month later on staff request, and a 7th in July of this year by Mr. Andrews' request. We also provided some additional information for the ALA throughout this summer. This is an overview map of the 7 ALA sites. The Casa Luz location is highlighted in kind of neon green there, and the ALA sites are in blue boxes. They surround both the Casa Luz service location and the development area, sections 23 and 26. The bottom of the slide here, you can see a summary of the offset distances from the alternative locations to various cultural features, but we'll go through these sites one by one here. This is another overview map of the ALA sites with 2,000-foot buffers around each site, and the ALA criteria table for each site. But again, we'll run through these one by one here. All right, we'll start with Casa Luz location. Not to repeat myself, but we do have 2 RBUs within 2,000 feet for which we have informed consent. We have an executed surface use agreement and no other factors that impact the ALA criteria. We do believe this to be the most protective location of the 7 you're about to see. We'll go to ALA site number 1 here. This is the Godel East and West pads on the south end of the development area within the city and county of Broomfield. At this site, we have 5 RBUs within 2,000 feet of the working pad surface, and we're in a DI community. We're upgrading from Stanley Ditch, and we're within Bald Eagle HPH here. Here we've moved to site 2, just north of the cost lease location. This site is platted for future commercial development. We have 3 RBUs within 2,000 feet of the working pad surface. And we have extremely limited ability to develop this under the SUA we have with the surface owner. Here we have site number 3. We've moved about 1 mile east. The advantage of this site is that it is a pre-existing oil and gas location. However, we do have 216 RBUs within 2,000 feet of the working pad surface, 26 of which are within 1,000 feet and the closest at 789 feet. Those RBUs are in a DIC. We're also within a 100-year floodplain, upgrading from a stream, in high priority habitat for aquatic native species. And we don't have any ability in our existing SUA to expand the pad site. Here in ALA site 4, we've moved north again from the Coslade site. We have no SUA here, but the biggest issue is the proximity to the existence of the defunct Eagle coal mine. The main entrance is within hundreds of feet of essentially the entire lot here. There are significant risks for void space and mechanical equipment underground, and due to safety concerns around subsidence and hitting some of that subsurface material, the site is not a wise choice. Here we've gone to alternative location number 5. This is on the northeastern corner of the development area. Here we have 37 RBUs within 2,000 feet of the working pad surface. 3 of these RBUs are within 1,000 feet, with the closest at 667 feet. The RBUs are in a DIC, and we're also in relatively close proximity to the Sweetgrass subdivision. We're upgrading into mapped wetlands, and we're within 110 feet of aquatic native species conservation waters. We also don't have an SUA for this site. We've moved now to the southeast side of the development area. This is ALA site number 6. Here we have 9 RBUs within 2,000 feet of the working pad surface, with the closest at 565 feet. Again, these RBUs are within a DIC. We're within 400 feet of Stanley Ditch and about 783 feet from a bald eagle nest site. And lastly, we have ALA site number 7. This is north of the development area. The biggest issue with this site is the presence of a high occupancy business building unit less than 500 feet of the working pad surface. That HOBU is a medical facility. We're also less than 2,000 feet from another DIC. And we are within the town of Dacono, and this site is not part of the MOU with Dacono. And lastly, the plot is actually of insufficient size to site the cost lease location, and we don't have an SUA. Oh, thank you, Jamie. We're just jumping back to an overview here of the of all the sites. As you can see, we did work up 7 ALA locations surrounding the development area, and we feel that Coslade East is the most protective choice. Quick overview of the pad design. We have 19 new wells here with separators, but no tanks. The large circles you see here are the MLBT freshwater frac tanks that will only be there for during the operational phase. We have 3-phase takeaway from the site that flows to our Erie hub. The site will be fully electrified, which is to say the drilling rig will be run on line power, as well as the facilities after in the production phase. We're looking at 27 acres of initial disturbance area, which will be reclaimed down to 10.6 acres after reclamation. We did have a commissioner question on the size of this site, and in comparison to some of the some pads that were called out in a petition. We had some time to review those, and the 2 extraction pads that were called out in that petition, the blue paintbrush and the Mickey 5F, were pads where with separate pad locations for the drill wells versus the facility, and the working pad surface acreage that was listed in that petition were just the drill pads. They didn't count the facility pads. So if you sum those together, we're actually close to the disturbance area we see here at Goslet East. Of course, with our 2A, we submitted a number of mitigation plans. Those are listed here. And with that, I will turn it over to Kathy Stearman to run through some of our cumulative impacts data.
Thank you, Dan. My name is Kathy Stearman, and I'm the Director of Air Programs for Civitas Resources. On the next 2 slides, we're going to walk you through the cumulative impact emission estimates for Goslet East. Our estimates for air emissions were filed 14 months ago in July of 2021, and since then we've gained more clarity and certainty around how the site will be developed and constructed. With the next 2 slides, we will walk through some of the cumulative emissions that were estimated at the time and show how Crestone has made known reductions through design improvements during that short time period. This set of numbers we're looking at here are for pre-production only, and we highlight our estimates for combustion emissions and estimated tank emissions for flowback. When this was filed, we, the air team, assumed we'd be using site-generated power for drilling, meaning drilling wouldn't be electrified, and we assumed we'd flow back into either temporary or permanent tanks, because if we're not 100% certain when filing these estimates, we typically include every action or operation that may be used on the pad. So today, these emission estimates would look lower using these BMPs and knowing they're in place. And the oil and gas emission inventories will help us resolve some of these refinements when the pads come online. We're now looking at the estimated production emissions, which reflect the early life of the production facility. By electrifying the facility, we eliminate most of the combustion emissions like NOx and CO. So we're focusing this discussion on the VOC, or volatile organic compound, column. For a facility like Goslet East, we don't see production entries in many of the categories as notated by the red strikes. And this is because the sources aren't on the pad, they've been eliminated. So focusing on the entries that are left, we wanted to call out mainstream construction practices that now add additional controls to a pad like Goslet East. For example, we will be installing continuous leak detection, which we'll talk about in the next slide. We eliminate venting and blowdowns by installing pressure vessels, and we manage potential Braden head emissions through the installation of catalytic heaters. And like the pre-production discussion, these new changes will inform our emissions reporting, which will be published in the Colorado Emission Inventory. As a side note, our emission reporting in Colorado is much more specific than the generalized emissions factors that were referenced in Ms. Ferrigno's opening statement. Our emission factors are largely tied to actual site samples that bring our reporting in Colorado to a higher level of accuracy. Our ambient air monitoring plan will be filed with the Air Pollution Control Division, and a variety of local governments will be able to weigh in on how that program is designed and executed. We will be adding additional monitoring or leak detection at Goslet as well, which is essentially a continuous optical gas imaging system. The benefits of this are triple-fold. It will help inform what our sensors see and remove some of the guesswork. It will take our leak detection from monthly to continuous, and will hopefully someday help us measure our emissions with a degree of certainty that further resolves all of those emission forms that we just talked about. This is an emerging technology, but we find value in testing it across our field in Colorado. And we understand there are commission questions about this system and what we'll be testing at Goslet East, so I welcome questions around that subject. Ready to answer. Lastly, we wanted to talk about the benefits of a plug and abandonment program for air. We've pulled out 2 producing old vertical facilities that may be in the path of the Coslet East P&A effort. These 2 facilities are very low oil producers, but they do have emissions. They have older separators, they load out oil, they may not have control devices for certain activities, and they mostly likely have natural gas actuated pneumatics. Our leak programs and audio, visual, and olfactory programs definitely bring older facilities like this to a much better standard in Colorado for sure, but as you can see, they still have emissions. Colorado also has a new focus on greenhouse gas reductions, as does Civitas. Older well sites have higher greenhouse gas intensities because they produce less hydrocarbons in general. We get much more better bang for our production buck when we turn these old wells into modern facilities, which have much lower greenhouse gas intensities, and I would say 1 or 2 orders of magnitude lower. I'll hand the presentation back to Mr. Dan Harrington.
Thank you, Kathy. I'll actually use this opportunity to address another commissioner question we received this week. And that question was whether Crestone considered P&A-ing more than just the wells that we have nominated in our P&A slide a few back. There are a number of vertical wells within the development area that are P&A candidates. And the answer to that question is that Civitas evaluates its legacy vertical wells for P&A on a variety of factors, including emissions, surface impact, production rate, and leasehold impacts. At present, we have identified the 6 critical P&As within the vicinity of the Coslet East OGDP that we're committing to now. But of course, the remaining wells will continue to be evaluated and ranked against other legacy verticals throughout our asset. Notably, Civitas's out of service list will be submitted to the COGCC this month, which will nominate additional wells with short-term P&A applications. With that, we can move on to public comments. This year, we did receive 40 public comments on the OGDP, which we carefully considered and provided public responses, which are posted. We got no public comments during our WOGLA process. Here, I'll run through a summary of the best management practices we'll plan to implement at this site. In the pre-production phase, we will have an electrified drilling rig and a quiet completions fleet, as well as full wrap 32-foot sound walls. We believe that will adequately mitigate any noise concerns. For lighting, we will design all lighting to be directed inward and downward, affixed to the inside of the sound walls where possible. For odor mitigation, we will use group 3 low odor drilling fluid. And again, we'll run the rig off grid power to reduce diesel emissions. And we do have a drill cuttings management practice system, and we'll use tier 4 engines or better during hydraulic fracturing. For dust, we will treat the pad surface and access roads with fresh water and stabilize our soil stockpiles throughout our operation. And in terms of leak detection, we will have no open pits on location, and we commit to twice daily equipment inspections during D&C and frequent pressure testing of all of our equipment. In the production phase, to mitigate emissions, again, this is a tankless location. We have produced water and oil pipelines leading off site that helps to reduce truck traffic. We'll have electrified production facilities with instrument air pneumatics, and we'll use both LACs and VRUs for offloading. There will be no permanent lighting on location. Odor will be mitigated by the use of oil and produced water pipelines, again, no trucking. This will also help us with noise. And in terms of leak detections, we will implement our comprehensive leak detection and repair program on site. And the site is automated with remote shutdown capabilities. We also have a list of CDPHE recommended BMPs for this site, and these are the air impacting BMPs. As you can see, there's a great number of these, and I'm not going to read through them one by one, but we did agree to the vast majority of these. CDPHE also recommended some water BMPs, and again, we agreed to most of them. And likewise for our CDPHE recommended waste and PFAS BMPs. Lastly, we have a list of BMPs that are tied to the town of Erie. These are both the town of Erie operator agreement BMPs as well as the additional BMPs requested. As part of this conversation with Erie, we also provided certificates of compliance with BMPs for past sites. And now finally on the BMPs, we have the Well County BMPs implemented during the WOGLA process. And with that, I'll turn it back to Jamie.
Great, thank you, Mr. Harrington. And with respect to the town of Erie's petition, again, like we said earlier, Crestone does appreciate the communication and the collaboration with the town of Erie on the Cosla East oil and gas location. We do not view Erie as a protester. We view them as a party and as a partner. And so what this slide shows is, again, our continued support for Erie's requested relief that Mr. Sullivan discussed earlier. And turning to the city and county of Broomfield's petition, Crestone does appreciate the communication about this hearing with Ms. Pranos, as well as Broomfield's engagement as a proximate local government. For the next portion of the presentation, of Crestone's direct presentation, I should say, Crestone will present evidence to support the fact that its cumulative impact analysis is compliant with the commission's regulations and that it supports the approval of the Cosla East Oil and Gas Development Plan. Dr. Tammy McMullen and Dr. Caitlin Hall from CTEH will present Crestone's evidence in support of this OGDP, specifically as it relates to Crestone's cumulative impact analysis, the potential for adverse health impacts from the Cosla East location, as well as the perceived health impacts contained in Broomfield's health survey. With that, I would like to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. McMullen and Dr. Hall and turn them over to the commission for their portion of Crestone's testimony. Chair, I would like to note that for purposes of efficiency and to remain within our timing allowances, Dr. McMullen and Dr. Hall may request that I skip some of the slides in the presentation. However, we would welcome any questions on those slides during the commissioner questions portion of the hearing. And I also need just a minute to pull up a separate PowerPoint for CTEH, just because of the size of the PowerPoint. Mr. Chair, is that coming through on your end?
It is.
Great, thank you. So with that, I would like to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Hall.
Ms. Jones, can you start on slide 2? Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Caitlin Hall. I'm a senior epidemiologist at CTEH, an environmental consulting firm. I want to begin by setting the scope of my and Dr. McMullen's testimony with Senate Bill 181 COGCC mandate, which states the commission shall regulate oil and gas operations in a reasonable manner to protect and minimize adverse impacts to public health, safety and welfare, the environment and wildlife resource, and shall protect against adverse environmental impacts on air, water, soil, or biological resource resulting from oil and gas operations. Our testimony today will focus on our expert analysis of the evidence provided to the commission that pertains to protecting and minimizing adverse impacts to public health, specifically from the proposed Crestone East well pad location. Skip to slide 7, please. I reviewed several studies that have been provided to the commission and referenced statements looking at various health outcomes related to upstream oil and gas. The next several slides, I want to focus on the Broomfield Health Symptoms Survey, outlining the key strengths and limitations in its epidemiological design as it relates to informing the commission on the question, does the Broomfield Health Survey show evidence that the best management practices do not minimize potential adverse public health impacts? Skip to slide 9, please. Let's start with an overall assessment of various study designs that epidemiologists use to evaluate the relationship between an exposure from a source, such as an emission from a well pad, and a health outcome. This figure shows the increasing strength of epidemiological study designs as we move up the pyramid, ranging from case reports to randomized clinical studies. There are three main factors that determine the strength of an epidemiology study. First is how well the study establishes the exposure occurred before the disease. Second, how well the exposure is characterized. And third, how well the disease is characterized. According to the authors of the Broomfield Health Survey, Weisner and McKinsey, the survey is a cross-sectional study design. Cross-sectional studies can be quick, cost-effective, and beneficial for preliminary investigations to direct more costly but stronger study designs. But cross-sectional study designs cannot show causality. This means that no matter how well exposures or diseases are characterized and how many confounding factors are considered in a cross-sectional survey, it can never show that an exposure causes health symptoms because exposures and disease status are collected at the same time. This does not allow for the study to distinguish if a disease occurred before the exposure or vice versa. For example, in order to determine if a chemical emission from a source caused a health outcome, the individual must be exposed to the chemical before developing the health outcome. Cross-sectional studies cannot determine this. As previously mentioned, the second factor in determining the strength of an epidemiology study is how well the exposure has been characterized. In the Broomfield Health Survey, residence distance from well pad was used as a surrogate for chemical air concentrations or exposure. They divided these distances into three categories: within 1 mile of the well pad, within 1 to 2 miles of well pads, and then greater than 2 miles from the well pads. Residence distance from well pads is not a reliable measure of exposure to chemical air concentrations from oil and gas well pad emissions. Air concentrations of volatile compounds disperse over very short distances and are dependent on many factors, such as meteorology, type of release, and frequency of release. There's not environmental evidence to support that distance from well pads correlates to a concentration gradient in measured community air concentrations. Therefore, distance from well pads measures as less than 1 mile, 1 to 2 miles, and greater than 2 miles does not provide an accurate measurement of community air concentrations or personal exposures. As previously mentioned, the third factor in determining the strength of an epidemiology study is how well the disease has been characterized. Weisner and McKinsey used self-reported symptoms as a surrogate for health impacts or disease. They asked respondents, in the past 14 days, indicate how often you've experienced the following symptoms. Respondents were given a Likert scale for each symptom that they included: never in the past 14 days, once within the past 14 days, 2 to 5 times within the past 14 days, 5 to 13 times within the past 14 days, and every day. They were asked about the following symptoms: difficulty sleeping, headaches, dizziness, anxiety or stress, numbness or tingling, nausea, vomiting, nosebleeds, ringing in the ear or hearing loss, shortness of breath, cough, runny nose, nasal congestion, lung irritation, throat irritation, eye irritation, skin irritation, muscle aches, weakness or pain, difficulty concentrating, or loss of energy or fatigue. Self-reported symptoms are not a reliable measure of health impacts or disease for the following reasons. First, they are at risk for biased responses due to their subjectivity, especially when the symptoms are non-specific to a certain disease. Second, self-reported symptoms are not the same as a diagnosed medical condition from a medical provider. This is important because self-reported symptoms are not standardized according to established medical criteria. Third, the symptoms listed in the survey are non-specific and can have numerous alternative causes other than environmental chemical exposures. For example, many of these symptoms are frequently reported in people with colds, flu, or COVID-19, yet respondents were not asked if they were diagnosed with any respiratory infections in the past 2 weeks. In addition, these self-reported symptoms could also be due to pre-existing chronic conditions. While the survey asked respondents about chronic conditions, Only the total number of conditions were adjusted for in the analysis. The reason this matters is that the analysis does not account for self-reported symptoms that could be, one second. Sorry, guys, my notes jumped off the screen. Let me start over. The reason this matters is the analysis does not account for self-reported symptoms that could be a result of specific conditions such as COPD or asthma. For example, a person could have only one chronic condition, but that condition could cause the self-reported symptoms. And finally, these symptoms could be due to behaviors and lifestyle factors, some of which were included in the analysis. The authors grouped the respondents' individual symptoms into symptoms categories. They found a slightly significant increase in the frequency of reported symptoms for upper respiratory and for acute symptoms. However, there are concerns with this analysis and the author's conclusions. These results are marginally significant with lower bound of the confidence intervals at 0.01 and 0.06, indicating these results are variable and likely would not be significant if the survey were repeated. Also, more than 50% of the upper respiratory symptoms were also included in the acute symptoms group, and these symptoms are likely driving significance in both groups. There is not evidence of a dose response where there are higher frequency of symptoms reported within 1 mile to the well pad compared to 1 to 2 miles in 2 or more miles. And finally, the results are difficult to interpret because the biological relevance cannot be described. The average sum Likert scores used in the analysis described before are not direct measures of the number of symptoms, meaning 1 unit higher average observed in the residents less than 1 mile compared to the residents more than 2 miles away from well pads could mean a higher proportion of once in the past 2 weeks, or it could mean a higher proportion of respondents answering every day instead of 5 to 13 times in the past 2 weeks. To drive this point home, the slide from the Broomfield Health Survey results shows how these summed Likert scores were calculated. Each category was assigned a number. Never was given 0. 1 to 2 times in the past 2 weeks was a 1. 2 to 5 times was a 2. 5 to 13 times a 3, and every day a 4. Then these scores were added up for each individual to get a summed Likert score. These sum scores were averaged across each setback distance group and compared to the greater than 2 miles from the well pad group. These comparisons cannot determine public health implications of a 1 unit difference between the groups that resulted in the statistical significant findings. For example, if the 1 unit difference represented a change between never to 1 symptom in the past 14 days, that could be a spurious correlation versus a large difference in frequency, such as 5 to 13 symptoms in 14 days versus symptoms occurring every day. Additionally, the increments in the Likert scale are not even in frequency of symptoms, while the sum Likert score is even with each increment. For example, we do not know if the average additional frequencies for each unit increase in the sum Likert score is because it could be 1 if moving from never to once in the past 14 days, or as many as 9 if moving from 2 to 5 times to 5 to 13 times in the past 14 days. That makes a big difference when we're talking about the public health implications of these findings. CTH analyzed the publicly available Broomfield Health Survey and preliminary analyses and found different results from Wisner and McKenzie's findings. Prior to modeling with adjustments, as was done by the authors of the surveys, the first step is to characterize the outcome or the self-reported symptoms by the exposure or distance to the well pads to examine for direct effects of a relationship. We conducted such an analysis and found, first, the total number of different self-reported symptoms were similar across all setback distance from well pads, as shown here, where on average respondents reported around 6 different symptoms in each setback group. Second, we found that the total frequency of symptoms as measured by the sum Likert scores were similar across all distances from well pads. This data is not presented here. This means that there's a uniform symptom profile in all distances from the well pads. If the symptoms were due to exposures from well pad emissions, then we would expect an exposure response profile where there would be an increased number and/or frequency of symptoms in those living closer to the well pads, even in this preliminary analysis. A natural next step in the survey analysis would be to evaluate potential biases. In the Broomfield Health Survey, Wisner and McKinsey included a critical question to help assess bias, which was measuring respondents' level of concern for environmental issues. Respondents were asked, please indicate how concerned you are with the following environmental issues near your place of residence. And respondents could answer with a Likert score of not at all concerned, slightly concerned, somewhat concerned, moderately concerned, or extremely concerned for topics of water, air, odor, noise, lighting, dust, traffic, oil spill, wildlife, and waste environmental concerns. The answers to air, noise, and odor were combined into a summed Likert score like the self-reported symptoms. Respondents that answered not at all concerned for air, noise, and odor were grouped into the least concerned, and respondents that answered slightly concerned or greater to at least one, air, noise, or odor, were grouped into the most concerned. Then the analysis described earlier, where the average sum Likert scores in those within 1 mile and 1 to 2 miles from the well pad were compared to those 2 or more miles away. It was repeated among those most concerned on the left and those least concerned on the right. When separating populations by this level of concern, the significant findings of increased frequency of self-reported upper respiratory and acute symptoms was removed from the respondents least concerned about air, noise, and odor. These results support an association between having concern for air, noise, and odor and self-reporting symptoms. It highlights potential bias in the prior significance that was found in the frequency of upper respiratory and acute symptoms. It also provides evidence that there is not a direct effect between distance to well pads and frequency of self-reported symptoms, but instead that there is an indirect effect that requires respondents to have concern over air, odor, and noise to show increased frequency of self-reported symptoms. To drive this point home, chemicals are agnostic to a person's level of concern. The way a chemical interacts with the cell has nothing to do with a person's conscious concern about oil and gas. Therefore, if toxicity were occurring, these two groups would look similar, meaning we would also see an observed increased frequency of symptoms in the least concerned group. Ms. Jose, please skip to slide 22. The survey authors accurately concluded that there were biases likely affecting these results. In the previous slide, I discussed evidence of perception bias, or where those most concerned about stressors are likely to notice and report symptoms. The authors point out other common survey biases, like recall bias for respondents' ability to recall symptoms over the past 2 weeks, and affiliation bias with a certain position for or against oil and gas. However, there's another important bias that the authors did not comment on, which is obsequiousness bias. This is when participants collaborate with researchers and give answers in the direction that they perceive are of interest to the researchers. Wisner and McKinsey did not consider obsequiousness bias, nor how they primed respondents for this bias. This is an example of priming respondents for obsequiousness bias. This survey authors inform respondents to think about oil and gas and their health from the mailer asking them to participate in the survey. The mailer stated, the questions will ask for health and demographic information to better understand resident health near and away from oil and gas activity. In addition, respondents who chose to participate were primed by the survey authors to think about oil and gas and their health in the consent for the survey. The consent stated, the goal of the research is to understand resident health in communities near and away from oil and gas operations. And again, with the statement, this survey is designed to help the city and county of Broomfield understand resident health in communities near and away from oil and gas operations. Broomfield primed respondents that sought additional information from Broomfield's website when they refer to the survey as the Oil and Gas Health Survey. This website was published at the onset of the survey administration. In a video posted on the Broomfield Oil and Gas Health Survey webpage, both researchers tell potential respondents or viewers what they research. Dr. Weisner stated that she focused the majority of her work on oil and gas related topics within, and Dr. McKenzie stated that she has been researching the health implications of developing oil and gas resource in neighborhoods for the past 11 years. In the same video, Dr. Weisner primed respondents again when she answered the question, "What is the Oil and Gas Health Survey?" by telling viewers and potential respondents that your responses have the potential to help guide further policy conversations around oil and gas in our community. If respondents are upset with oil and gas in their neighborhood, and they know that responding to Broomfield's health survey in a certain manner will drive policy, then they would be motivated to answer questions in a way that can influence the policy towards their position about oil and gas. Last point I want to make, Broomfield claims that their survey used a similar design to other self-reported symptom surveys in Pennsylvania. However, the authors of those studies noted that they intentionally designed their symptoms assessments to not mention oil and gas development or activities as to not influence respondents. Please skip to slide 38. I have presented several concerns regarding the limitations and biases of the Broomfield Health Survey that Broomfield is using to draw their conclusions about the potential for emissions from Crestone Coslet's East well pad to result in adverse health impacts. In our preliminary analysis to characterize the potential for health symptoms to be associated with exposure directly from well pad emissions, we found no difference in the numbers and frequencies of self-reported symptoms by those living within 2 miles of the well pads compared to those living more than 2 miles from the well pads. We were also able to replicate the bias observed where respondents most concerned reported more number and frequency of symptoms in the less than 1 mile group compared to the 2 or more miles away, indicating the results observed in the Broomfield Health Survey were driven by concern for air, odor, and noise rather than directly due to chemical exposures from well pad emissions. Additionally, the Broomfield Health Survey cannot conclude that well pads cause increased number or frequency of symptoms because it's a cross-sectional study design, and it cannot rule out reverse causality. It does not establish what came first, distance to the well pads or self-reported symptoms, as they were collected simultaneously. Overall, the Broomfield Health Survey results do not show Coslet East well pad emissions would be expected to cause adverse health impacts to residents living up to 2 miles away. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Tammy McMullen.
Well, commissioners, can you hear me okay? Sure that I.
Yes.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon. My name is Dr. Tammy McMullen. I am a senior toxicologist with CTEH. I'll start by providing the commission with a little bit of background information about how we as toxicologists and public health risk assessors evaluate the potential for public health risk impacts related to chemical exposures. First off, we use a regulatory framework, as I show you here in this slide, that's established by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. It's used to characterize the likelihood for adverse public health impacts, including cumulative impacts from chemical exposures from one source or perhaps multiple sources, for example, such as multiple oil and gas well pads, along with other non-oil and gas sources, as you can see on the left side. Starting on the left side of this slide, air emissions from well pad operators, for example, could result in measurable concentrations of chemicals at the fence line of a well pad. Those concentrations disperse, and diminish into the surrounding air outside the fence line that could then be measured possibly within community areas. The measurements that we collect in the community represent cumulative chemical exposures from all sources of emissions, which could include multiple well pads and other non-well pad sources, such as vehicular traffic, nearby highways, or other kinds of sources. So these measurements within a community represent exposures from chemicals in the air that people breathe, where they may live, work, or play. The main question before the commission that I'll be addressing today is, do proposed emission best management practices at the Coslet East well pad sufficiently minimize exposures and potential adverse public health impacts to nearby communities? The green arrows represent where the BMPs proposed for the Coslet East well pad will be implemented to minimize emissions. My presentation will focus on the extensive existing air monitoring and public health risk studies that can directly inform the commission about applicable exposures and potential for adverse health impacts from Crestone's proposed Coslet East well pad. Since 2017, multiple researchers have conducted community air monitoring during well pad operations using BMPs consistent with those that will be implemented at the proposed Coslet East well pad. All these data are directly relevant for estimating exposures and risks to potentially exposed populations within 2,000 feet from Coslet East well pad. These studies were conducted across 10 well pads that use similar BMPs and during all different phases of pre-production and production. I'm going to walk you through the results from these studies. Jamie, would you please skip to slide 42? The first data set that I will discuss is that of Broomfield's air monitoring program, which is implemented by Ajax Analytics. Although, as I understand Ms. Pirano's statements earlier in her opening statements, it seems as though Broomfield is undermining the importance of their entire extensive air monitoring program that they've conducted for multiple years, as though EPA guidelines do not apply. I would like to say that Broomfield has done an amazing job with having an extensive program, and that's what I'd like to show you of all the data that can be used to inform. Ajax has placed instruments around areas in Broomfield near well pads and in community areas near those well pads that are operated by extraction. These instruments continuously measure total volatile organic compounds, or VOCs. These instruments are called PIDs. When these PIDs measure an arbitrarily selected concentration of VOCs, they're triggered to activate a canister to start collecting an air sample. Those air samples are collected for a continuous 60 seconds, and then the canister closes. These air samples are then sent to a lab to be analyzed for the chemical composition and the concentrations of those chemicals. These 60-second air concentration measurements can provide information about the composition of chemicals at the time of the sampling, but it's important to note that they do not represent a duration of exposure that is relevant for public health decision-making. The broadly accepted method used by EPA and other regulatory agencies for estimating exposures to assess the potential for public health impacts would be to let the canister collect an air sample for at least 60 minutes so that the direct comparisons can be made to short-term or long-term health guidance values. Because these health guideline values are established with very specific durations of exposure in mind by toxicologists understanding the toxicity data, they're set at concentrations for durations for at least 1 hour or longer. Because Ajax does not collect samples for longer than 1 minute, they must use an extrapolation method that has not been validated by any environmental regulatory agency to estimate a 1 hour concentration from their 60-second measurements. Additionally, I'd like to point out Ajax has 12 monitoring locations throughout Broomfield. 9 of those locations are designated by Ajax as near source. and 3 locations are designated as community impact sites. What this means is that those near source locations are on or immediately adjacent to the well pads. They are not in communities and therefore do not directly estimate community exposures. As I previously stated, measurements designated by Ajax as near source do not represent measurements in the community where people live, work, and play. Therefore, they don't represent any exposure that can be measured and used to evaluate potential for adverse health impacts. Broomfield alleges over a dozen plumes of benzene were above the short-term minimal risk level of 9 part per billion. However, Broomfield is erroneously comparing Ajax's 60-second near source plume detections to public health guideline values that are intended to be compared to air measurements collected over longer periods of time within community areas as an estimate of exposure. For example, Ajax states in their quarterly reports that over 75% of their 60-second triggered samples have occurred within 300 feet from a well pad. Yet Broomfield uses these data to support their conclusions that Coslet East well pad is likely to produce adverse health impacts such as those reported in the Public Health Oil and Gas Health Survey. Of all the triggered samples that have been collected by Ajax since the beginning of their program, over 90% of those samples have been near source locations. So in order to understand what the potential adverse health impacts may be to potentially expose communities near the well pads, the data collected at community locations could be evaluated. So to date, there have been 8 samples triggered in community locations over the course of the last 2 years. All of Ajax's 1-hour estimates of benzene were below the CDPHE health guidance value of 9 parts per billion. This means that the measured concentrations in the communities were unlikely to pose adverse health impacts to receptors living near these facilities. In addition to Broomfield's trigger canister program, Ajax also collects 7-day continuous air samples at community and near source locations. According to Ajax, no individual weekly measurements of benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylenes, also commonly known as BTEX, have approached their short-term health guideline values. These are the same weekly measurements as I showed in the previous slide. Here, Ajax compares the benzene concentrations to long-term non-cancer guideline values of 3 part per billion, which is shown by the orange vertical line. Again, all benzene measurements were below long-term health guideline values that is protective of a person breathing these levels continuously over their lifetime. In addition, Ajax also compares their week-long samples collected at near source, as shown in the right column, community, shown in the middle column, or background locations, which is shown on the left. As you can see from this slide, the distribution of community concentrations are similar to those in the background. So in contrast to Broomfield's allegations, Ajax concludes in their latest report in Q2 of 2022 that no compounds to date have surpassed CDPHE's health guideline values. Please skip to slide 52. So I'm going to now move to studies that have been conducted by CTH. But before I share with you the overall findings from those studies, I want to give the Commission a quick background summary of other health risk information that we knew at the time of designing these studies. In 2019, CDPHE released a report entitled Human Health Risk Assessment for Oil and Gas Operations in Colorado. This study used actual emissions data from oil and gas operations in Colorado to estimate or model hypothetical exposures and risks of health impacts from a generic well pad operating in the Front Range and on the western slope. The main findings from that study were: 1, no elevated risk of chronic health impacts at 500 feet or greater from lifetime exposures to oil and gas related compounds. And 2, under certain modeled worst case conditions, such as downwind of a well pad during peak emissions, during some pre-production phases like flowback, there were elevated risks of short-term health impacts, largely from exposure to benzene, toluene, and ethyl toluenes. Although this study was pivotal for prioritizing further research and risk management decision-making, there were several uncertainties regarding the relevance of these findings to current operations. First, the study used emission data collected by Colorado State University in 2014 and 2015, which clearly, as we know, does not represent current oil and gas operations and current BMPs. For example, some of the emission data were collected from well pads with open top tanks during flowback. As was recommended as next steps by the authors of the CDPHE-funded study, CTH designed air monitoring studies to estimate public exposures and potential for short and long-term adverse health impacts, specifically due to emissions from Crestone and extraction well pad operations with current BMPs. CTH has collected real-time instantaneous air monitoring samples, as well as 24-hour samples that were sent to the labs to characterize the chemical composition in the air. CTH collected samples for more than 100 days, with over 500 analytical samples sent to labs. We've collected those samples at distances from less than 300 feet to 5,000 feet away from up to 10 well pads during all phases of oil and gas development, and taken it multiple times of the year to account for impacts of meteorological changes in the seasons. Skip to slide 54, please. To specifically address the elevated short-term risks identified in the CDPHE report that could occur as a result of intermittent and short-lived well pad emissions during different pre-production phases, CTH collected instantaneous readings in real time in communities near various oil and gas well pads that used BMPs similar to those proposed in the Coslet East well pad. CTH conducted the study under conditions that would maximize the potential of capturing maximum air concentrations. For example, CTH staff collected measurements during times when on-pad activities were expected to result in peak emissions. In addition, CTH staff focused on collecting data in downwind directions of the well pads. CTH collected over 24,000 real-time measurements across 10 different Crestone or extraction well pads. Detections of total VOCs in community areas were infrequent and sporadic, with maximum detections generally in the low parts per billion range. And as a reminder, measuring total VOCs means that we're measuring all types of VOCs, which represents cumulative exposures that could occur down to the 1 parts per billion level, which is well below the health guideline value for any VOC of concern. In addition, benzene was never detected, even during times when benzene and VOCs were detected on the well pads during specific pre-production activities. In addition to real-time air monitoring data, CTH collected stationary canister samples in areas around well pads. These canisters collect air continuously over the course of 24 hours, which ultimately provides an average concentration from that location that can be compared directly to health guideline values. Relevant health guideline values are represented in the figures by dashed orange lines, and the chemical concentrations given in the figures are in the parts per billion range, or ppb. In total, CTH collected over 400 samples by this sampling method. These samples were collected during all phases of well pad operations, as shown on the x-axis of the figures. Because this is the most likely time to detect elevated levels of oil and gas related compounds such as BTEX. In this slide, I'm only showing you the compounds that have been identified as those that drive the risk. However, we also measured multiple other compounds that are consistent with those compounds that are measured by CDPHE during their oil and gas investigations. Overall, no 24-hour average concentrations for each individual compound exceeded acute health guideline values, which is represented by the dotted orange line toward the top of the graphs. As a conservative health protective approach consistent with EPA risk assessment methodology, we also evaluated the potential for long-term health risks by comparing the maximum 24-hour measurements to their chronic health guideline value. This guideline comparison value is shown by the dotted orange lines toward the bottom of the graphs. It's important to note that these chronic health guideline values are meant to be protective of continuous exposures lasting 365 days or more. So a single 24-hour sample above this concentration does not represent an exceedance of the chronic health guideline value. Only 2 24-hour samples had concentrations that were higher. However, both of those samples were about 300 feet from the well pad. None of the community samples were ever above even the chronic health comparison value. Contrary to Ms. Pirano's opening statement, EPA actually has well-established methods for evaluating cumulative risk from air toxics. This method is outlined in their Air Toxics Risk Assessment Technical Guidance Manual. Although I do not show our evaluation of the cumulative adverse health risks due to the multiple chemicals, we also did follow EPA's method to evaluate the potential for adverse health impacts due to cumulative exposures of all of the measured oil and gas related compounds. Both short and long-term exposures to all VOCs were not expected to result in adverse health impacts. Overall, CTH's public health impact findings are actually quite consistent with those from Broomfield. Both air monitoring studies have clearly indicated that VOCs that may be emitted from well pads operated by Crestone or Extraction, which have similar BMPs as those proposed by the Coslet East well pad, are unlikely to result in exposures that could lead to adverse short or long-term health impacts, and therefore minimizing public potential for harm from exposure to VOCs. In addition to the data I've presented from both AJAX and CTH, CDPHE and ERIE have also conducted air monitoring and evaluated the potential adverse public health impacts at 4 different Crestone and 1 extraction well pad that used BMPs similar to those proposed for the Coslet East well pad. These studies measured air concentrations of many different oil and gas VOCs at distances as close as 500 feet from a well pad during all pre-production operational phases since 2017. One of the most comprehensive studies to date near an oil and gas well pad was a study conducted by CDPHE at the Livingston well pad operated by Extraction. CDPHE parked their mobile lab, also called the Camel, near the Extraction Livingston well pad and collected over 4,000 hours of air measurements during all pre-production phases. Overall, CDPHE and ERIE have concluded in their studies that the air measurements collected near Crestone and Extraction well pad operations were unlikely to pose short or long-term adverse health impacts to nearby potentially exposed populations. In conclusion, Dr. Hall and I have presented data to the Commission that directly inform the question, do proposed emission best management practices at Coslet East well pad sufficiently minimize exposures and potential adverse health impacts to nearby communities? As Dr. Hall presented, the Broomfield Oil and Gas Health Survey cannot conclude that well pads with similar BMPs to those on the Coslet East well pad cause increased number or frequency of symptoms. In addition, all air monitoring studies conducted around well pads using similar BMPs to those proposed by the Coslet East well pad consistently show potential exposures to hazardous air pollutants related to oil and gas are below conservative health guideline values. Based upon the available evidence from similar well pads, the emission best management practices proposed at the Coslet East well pad will minimize potential adverse health impacts due to hazardous air pollutant emissions. Finally, I would like to state that we have also ran the EPA and the CDPHE environmental justice tools to determine if areas surrounding the Coslet East well pad would be considered disproportionately burdened. All census blocks surrounding the Coslet East well pad location are below the 80th percentile of all EPA environmental justice indices, which is EPA's criteria for further consideration of environmental justice concerns. And according to CDPHE's EnviroScreen, there is not a disproportionately impacted community within 2 miles of the Coslet East well pad location. Thank you for your time.
Great. Thank you, Dr. McMullen. Chair, that will wrap up Crestone's case in chief. Obviously, we would welcome any cross-examination questions and any commissioner questions if you choose to do that today.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I think what I would like to do is have cross-examination by Broomfield now, and then the response by Crestone is available for you, Ms. Jost. If we could get through those 2 things, I think that would be good for the day. And then commissioners we would start tomorrow with commissioner questions. And commissioners, I'm sort of anchoring it that way because some of our questions may be covered in both cross and response. And that way we would be sort of holding off on asking questions until the full case in chief is presented. Is that okay with the lawyers, Ms. Jost and Ms. Paranos?
Yes, that works for Crestone.
Yes, that works for us as well.
Okay, Ms. Paranos, the witness is yours. Witnesses, all of them collectively.
Thank you very much.
Ms. Paranos, I'm so sorry to jump in, but if I could ask our witnesses to come back on screen, I'd like to do that. So Dr. McMullen, Dr. Hall, and then Mr. Harrington, can you also, I see Mr. Harrington and Ms. Stearman. So thank you. We now have everyone. Sorry, Ms. Paranos.
Thank you, Ms. Jost. I just have a couple questions for Dr. McMullen. So you referenced in your testimony just now measurements that CTEH took at 10 well sites, including the extraction well sites in Broomfield. Is that correct?
Correct.
Can you identify which exhibit, Crestone and perhaps Ms. Jost, you might be helpful here, which exhibit included the information on those 10 well sites? We are aware of the cumulative impacts plan, which did discuss a CTEH study that identified measurements taken at 4 well sites operated by Crestone. But I'm curious about the if there was an exhibit that discussed the measurements taken at those other well sites.
Jamie, would you like to speak to, Ms. Jost, would you like to speak to the?
Yes, and Ms. Paranos, thank you for the question. And I believe, Ms. McMullen, that the reference to the well sites were included in our PowerPoint presentation specifically. Ms. Paranos, I do not believe that each of the 10 were specifically called out in an exhibit in support, other than our presentation that we did submit in accordance with the case management order.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Just a few more questions, Ms. McMullen or Dr. McMullen. I'm curious about if the information that you provided regarding the measurements that were taken at those additional 6 well sites, is that information that's publicly available?
Ms. Jost, if you would like to share, if those could be provided.
Share the screen, Dr. McMullen.
Well, the other 6, I'm not sure if they had been provided as exhibits per se, but they are available. I know they have been provided at times to the commission, but perhaps not with this particular hearing.
Yes, and sorry,
it is
Dr.
possible.
McMullen. I see what you're saying. So,
Yeah.
Ms. Pranos, so everything that Dr. McMullen testified to is publicly available data. And again, Ms. McMullen, please correct me if I'm wrong, but the CTEH study that Dr. McMullen has been referencing is part of the cumulative impacts plan that was submitted with the Coslet East location. And so that would be exhibit, I'm sorry, give me 1 second.
Right, Ms. Jost, that's okay. So I am aware of the cumulative impacts plan. It is just that plan discussed data that was collected at 4 well sites as opposed to the 10 well sites. So my question was just wanting to know
Yes.
where we could find information on those other 6 well sites that are not included in the cumulative impacts plan, but are included in Ms. McMullen's, Dr. McMullen, I'm sorry,
Yes,
Dr.
it's all
McMullen's
right.
slide.
No problem. I believe that probably what was included in the impact plan were only the studies that CTH had conducted for Crestone. However, we can discuss with the team around the additional studies that were in Broomfield related to extraction operations. I have not seen the cumulative impacts plan, Ms. Paranos, but I could talk with the team about that. Thank you. Now I understand what you're saying. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yes, yes,
Okay.
thank you. I think it would be great.
That's
Yes,
probably where the difference is. Absolutely.
exactly. Yes, that would be great.
Okay.
And just so perhaps once we get that information, it would help clarify. I think we have some questions just around
Sure.
how those studies were conducted.
Okay. I can tell you that just for now, they were actually conducted in quite an identical manner to the 4 that have been described probably in that impact study for Crestone. We specifically designed that study, as I had stated earlier in these slides, in a very similar manner, and so that the data could actually be used across all the well pads and evaluated similarly.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Sure.
And Ms. Pranos, if I may, we had a list of materials that was attached to the supplemental witness and exhibit list submitted to you and the commission on October 5th. And I will work with Dr. McMullen as well, but I believe that those were disclosed in that aspect as well.
The identification of those, but not the data discussing the methodology and the specific findings. Is that correct?
The identification as well as the identification of the study, as well as the document linked to each of those studies that would contain those materials.
I see. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
You're
We can take a
welcome.
look at that. Appreciate that. I don't think I have any other questions for any of the witnesses at this time.
Okay, Ms. Jost, did you want to take up an opportunity in the pre-hearing order for quote response by Crestone to the cross?
Mr. Chair, I believe that we are okay for now. We recognize that later in the case management order, there is time for rebuttal after the direct presentation by the city and county of Broomfield. So we will hold our time until that.
Okay. All right, well, that was quicker than I was anticipating. And so perhaps we could go to commissioner questions at this point, Ms. Jost, and we might be able to, if we get through that, then that might be an appropriate breaking point for the afternoon. Commissioners, are y'all ready to do questions, or do you want the evening and come back in the morning? It's your call.
I'd like to see if we can get through questions, Mr. Chair.
All right, go ahead. I recognize you, Ms. McGowan.
Oh, lucky me. Thanks, everybody, for the presentation. I'd like to start, I think, first by talking about the number of wells that will be P&A'd as part of this proposal. So is it the 2 or is it 6?
It's 6.
Okay. And did you all submit as part of P&ing those 6, what the total emissions reductions will be so that we could figure out what the offset might be compared to what emissions might be added from this new site? Because if you did, I missed it and I apologize. I think your Form 2B just had the 2 wells.
That's correct. Thank you for your question, Commissioner. We did not include plug and abandonment in our cumulative emissions as an offset because when we're looking at P&A emissions, we're looking at the removal of tank batteries. And I don't know if we had that level of certainty at the time to say, we know that these surface sources are going to disappear or be eliminated. So yeah, I don't think that's been quantified at this time.
Okay, sorry, maybe so are these wells that we're talking about, have they already been plugged and abandoned? And you were just talking about removing ancillary equipment that might be associated with them?
Yeah, when we're considering air emissions on the calculation side, the ancillary equipment is really what we're looking at. I think the other thing that's important to note that when we're looking at emissions and the emissions that we're going to remove in specific for wells that have been either TNA'd, temporarily abandoned, or are not producing or shut in, aren't going to give us an emissions impact.
Thank you. So these sites aren't currently being visited by trucks to remove fluids, probably maybe just for people to check in on because they're not producing. Is that, I just want to make sure I'm understanding.
Thank you, Commissioner, for that question. I don't know if I can answer whether or not there's oil loaded out or what product might be in the tanks. If there are tanks that are associated with these wells, like I said, we don't have that. I don't have that level of detail, but I can tell you that existing facilities are on our monthly inspection schedule. So we do the audio, visual, and olfactory inspections on those existing sites.
Okay, thank you. I think I'm curious to understand, and I appreciate you responding to the question that, and I might not be the only commissioner who submitted kind of this curiosity about how many wells are owned by Crestone that are temporarily abandoned or shut in, or I guess that's, or low producing that might be considered for P&Aing that could offset the emissions that would be added as part of this proposal. And I think it's important to me because I think in this instance, which is different maybe from some other proposals that we've had, you have communities that are expressing concern about this additive amount. Regardless of what we think the impact might be, they're concerned about this additive amount of emissions in their community. And it just feels like it might be good faith effort to say, here are some locations that we could offset. And this kind of impact, even though we think it's protective of public health, we wouldn't be able to minimize what we're adding to this catchment area or the communities that are around the site. And so I felt like I read somewhere in the documentation that somewhere in the past, there may have been a proposal with Broomfield to plug and abandon more than just these 6 sites. And then that idea was kind of dropped. I guess I personally thought that might have been a good thing to put on the table, even if you have a community saying we're never going to be okay with what you're doing. It might have been a good thing to put forth as part of saying, I hear what this community is saying and I'm trying to address it. So I don't know if you want to respond to that. It was kind of me just going off on a tangent, but.
Commissioner McGowan, I can at least give you some numbers in response to this. There are approximately 30 non-P&A'd Crestone legacy vertical producers in the development area. And again, we're committing up front to doing 6 of those. I think the thing to consider here is that we have a master list of legacy P&As that we rank on a lot of factors: emissions, braden head issues, surface impact, whether they're producing, and leasehold impacts. And the conversation we had with Broomfield was essentially to nominate some of the wells out of turn, bring them higher on the list than we would normally get to them. we didn't come to a resolution with them on that. They said not interested. So we moved on to the 6 wells that were critical for this operation. Of course, all of those wells remain on that list. They remain in constant evaluation. And we're also not wanting to step in front of our out of service list that's due at the end of this month, as you know, as well.
But, well, conversely, you could gain some brownie points by saying we've moved them up and we're going to get that done sooner. We're not even going to have to put them on the out of service list. This could be for Dr. McMullen or for Ms. Hall. Are you doctor? And Dr. Hall. So the comment about it's obsequiousness. Could it also be that someone who's very concerned about oil and gas also maybe became very concerned about oil and gas after they started having symptoms, whether it's headaches or nosebleeds or difficulty breathing? Could it also work the other way?
Yes, Commissioner. I'm sorry, there's feedback. 1 second.
Let me turn myself off and see if that helps.
You are correct, but we would still expect to see a relationship when we remove that concern in the least concern group. So if a relationship still exists between distance from well pad to self-reported symptoms, we would expect to see that when we remove the respondents who were most concerned, and we did not.
Thank you. And then I was wondering, I think if I'm I see a lot of CTEH studies submitted as part of operators' OGDP applications for their cumulative impacts. And when you all do these, are they each individually tailored? So in this instance, you collected information that will be relevant just to this Crestone proposal. This is not a general study that gets turned in by many operators for the same purpose. You actually looked at this site, similar sites and similar BMPs, and said, yes, this would be protective if these BMPs were in place.
Thank you, Commissioner McGowan. That's a good question. So you're exactly right. Although some of the study designs that we've done for both Crestone and Extraction and other operators throughout Colorado have had a similar study design, we actually work with the operators to understand exactly what the BMPs are in place. As part of the study design, like I mentioned, with respect to doing the real-time monitoring, where we have staff roaming in communities and we collect these instantaneous samples. At the same time, we actually have staff that are on the well pad collecting, and we know about the VOC emissions, we know exactly what sources, et cetera. And when we're getting, for example, detections of VOCs or benzene on the well pad, and we designed it specific for those particular facilities. So even though the general design that we've used has been similar, it's, we're really directing it based upon the meteorological conditions, what the well pad is, et cetera, at that time, and working with the operator to understand that at a really comprehensive level.
Thank you. And then based on all this data that you've been collecting with these operators, what BMPs do you think, based on data that you've been collecting, are the most helpful in reducing, lowering, minimizing emissions?
Well, I've seen several of the BMPs that I believe Dan showed today during, for example, what they discussed. And one of the points, I believe, was with respect to, give me 1 second because I'm still learning the terminology too. For example, no produced water storage tanks. I think that's a huge a reduction in emissions that could result in potential impacts, of exposures. However, I will say that Crestone and Extraction well pads that I and my team conducted studies on at that time, I believe that the BMPs that are even being proposed now at the new Coslet East well pad are above and beyond what was even done in those studies at that time, because the technology has just changed so fast. And one of the biggest things that I've noticed was what was a concern with the CDPHE modeling study, like I had mentioned, that was very generic, but informed us that flowback and sometimes short-term intermittent activities during flowback could result in the highest potential risks. And that's what the results of that CDPHE study had shown. Well, being that I've been on these well pads and spent hundreds of hours literally on the well pads to see that flowback is not at all like what has been or what was used at the time when those emission data were collected. So they also don't have any oil storage tanks. So the storage piece of it really took away even evaluating long-term chronic health impacts, because it's really only talking about pre-production now, because we don't have storage, we don't have produced water tanks, et cetera. And that really makes a difference, because we could find sometimes intermittent detections on a well pad for other types of operations when those produced water tanks were on the pad. You could get when say trucks would come to remove the water from the tanks, and you would get very short term when there's like changes, right, to pull that out, you could detect VOCs on the pad or benzene. But when that's removed, I think that that's a big piece pretty much of what was probably identified during flowback as possible concerns back in the 2014 and 15 time. So that's why I'm so confident, Commissioner McGowan, that the BMPs that are being proposed will minimize adverse public health impacts based upon all the information that I've collected on a well pad and in communities.
Thank you. My dogs are nuts, so I'm gonna go mute.
And Commissioner McGowan, Chair, I'm sorry. Ms. Stearman, did you want to add anything to Dr. McMullen's response?
Yes, thank you, Ms. Jost. I wanted to just add that the data sets are building on a variety of different ways to construct well pads. So BMPs aside, there is enhanced monitoring programs that are negotiated with local governments and the CDPHE in areas where we have interest in our monitoring plans. And we've tried to put a focus on public health data collection around those pads by adding a layer of methodology that we believe helps also explain what exposure might be on well sites with tanks or well sites with oil tanks. So it's building the data sets that we can reference for a variety of well pads. If anybody wants to access that, it would be available through the CDPHE.
And sorry, Mr. Chair, I had one more question. I was curious to try to understand what the continuous optical gas imagery technology is, because that sounds like it's something new that you're talking about that will help maybe detect a leak faster, or I'm not quite sure. And I know everyone's really tired. So if you could just kind of briefly understand why it's something new and different and why it's significant and helpful.
Yes, Commissioner, thank you for the question. I'll try to be brief. We are testing new technologies. They are intended to enhance our leak detection and our ambient monitoring programs. It's emerging. It's not readily available yet. It's not off the shelf, but essentially it's a camera that will be mounted at the center of a pad. It rotates on a pan and tilt camera. It visits segments of the pad every 3 minutes. So it gives a full rotation within 1 hour. So basically every hour we're doing a leak detection. But so it's really going to help us enhance how to answer questions about what are our ambient air monitors seeing. But really what we need to do with these new systems is build what we call machine learning. So we have to give it feedback as operators and subject matter experts on what it's seeing and what's important to relay feedback to the operator. And so that data is being built and built and built upon. And then there's also artificial intelligence element to it. So we're really hoping that, we opened some of our testimony today about how we estimate our emissions and is that right? Is it good? This is bringing these two trains together of the emissions that we estimate on paper and the emissions that we think we can measure. So that's artificial intelligence. It's crazy, new and interesting, but ultimately, in a nutshell, it will tell us if there's a leak on a pad within the hour.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Messer, I've got a couple of follow-up questions, and I'll recognize you. Going back to the CDPHE BMPs on air, they have developed 38 suggested BMPs in their spreadsheet, and they threw all 38 at this one. And if my math is right, Crestone agreed to 29. So there's a handful that either Crestone felt was inapplicable or not relevant, or whatever. Are you familiar? So you guys are the experts, and I'm looking at Dr. McMullen and Dr. Hall. Did you look at that, and did you have any concerns, or did it alter your opinion that not all 38 air BMPs from CDPHE were being agreed to?
Commissioner Robbins, it's a good question that I haven't seen those 38, but I'd be happy to take a look at that and give you a response back. I'm just not familiar with that.
Okay.
So
it's
some of them may not even apply, because since every operator might do something slightly different. But I'm not,
well,
maybe, yeah.
Normally this gets answered by someone like Mr. Harrington, but I was just taking advantage of the fact that we got two experts in the field on air in the panel. So maybe overnight, if you
I'd like to see it though. It's piqued my curiosity.
Yeah, if overnight, if you could take a look at the 38 air BMPs, there's also a half a dozen involving water and waste and PFAS, but I'm not asking you about those. I just was like, heck, I've got the experts in the room. I should take advantage of that. So that's question one. Question two, Ms. Joseph.
Yes, sorry, Chair, to interrupt, but Ms. Stearman can actually address those air BMP questions where on the chart, and this would be our slide page 53, where the answers were no with respect to air. And if you would like, Ms. Stearman can address those, and then we will of course work with Dr. McMullen over the course of the evening to have her review as well. But Ms. Stearman,
that's fine. Yeah, that's fine. Why don't we pull that slide up and have Ms. Stearman answer it? But I am interested in the air experts analysis of that as well, and maybe we can do that in the morning.
Absolutely. Let me get it pulled up here.
Ooh, that's really little.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair, for your question. I have them in front of me in a different type of format, so I'm going to try to work with the screen I have open, and please just ask if there's something I'm missing. We were talking a little bit about non-road construction equipment as far as BMPs and how far our reach can go and the expectations on the tier of their engines. We did investigate that to see if that's something that would be something that we could influence. Learning more about how our construction operations go, we just understand that we're not going to have that much control over the fleets. When we ask for a construction job to be implemented, our construction companies then are going to attack that workload from whatever means necessary to get the right equipment on site. So that seemed to be out of our control. They're mobile sources. I think if we're going to be looking at Airbnbs to, if we're looking at it from an ozone standpoint or from that lens, those sources are going to be looked at from the lens of the Air Quality Control Commission, and all of those industry will have to take measures if that becomes something we think is going to move the needle in Colorado. So that's really how we related the no's to construction fleets. We talked a little bit about compressors. We have a no, although I've learned a lot more about what we can do with compressors. Our compression at Costlet East is going to be electrified. But if there are emissions that we can root back due to, we're going to get into reciprocating and rod packing conversations, which you probably don't want to hear, but we do maintenance on them. So that's the message, is that we're regulated and we have standard practices to do maintenance. We talked a little bit about odor. There was one specific one that we worked with the CDPHE on regarding drilling fluid being removed from pipes. I think we were just concerned that the suggestion of removing drilling fluid from all piping prior to storage was maybe unachievable. And we referenced back to the BMP ahead of it, which does show that we are willing to wipe the exterior of the drilling pipe for an odor mitigation BMP, for example. So I think we agreed with the CDPHE that they were both trying to achieve the same thing. And then back to the ozone conversation, because it comes up a lot. We have tried to commit to segregating out what we believe we can do as a feasible line item as a BMP expectation, and then carve out the ones that might be maybe either a safety issue or an emissions disbenefit. So we have some recommended language that Crestone's willing to add in if that helps further the BMP list. Hope that helps.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that. We can stop the screen share at this point. So back to the doctors. I don't know if you're a doctor, Dr. Hall, but I'm calling you one. You guys had to skip some slides. I don't want to, so the question's kind of open-ended. Were there any skipped slides that were good ones that we need to know about? And if so, do you want to go back and show them to us? I mean,
that is a good question. Can you give us just a second?
Yeah, and while you're thinking about that, I have a
Mhm.
question for Ms. Jost and Mr. Sullivan.
Okay.
So y'all think about that. I'll go to my completely unrelated question. So, Mr. Sullivan, the Erie operator agreement has attached to it these BMPs, and your client is desirous of those BMPs being attached to the 2A, if I understand this right. And Ms. Jost, your client has agreed to that. Just a couple of comments. How come? I mean, if you've got a contractual agreement with Crestone, you can enforce your BMPs as a local government. You can be even stricter at this point. And is there, are there any concerns of sort of inconsistent enforcement if it's a part of our 2A? And also, and this is kind of an open-ended question for everybody in the room, we've got Erie BMPs, we got COGCC BMPs, we got Weld County BMPs, and we got CDPHE BMPs. Has anybody done kind of a crosswalk to see if there's any conflict going on there? So the first question is, how come the Erie ones need to be on our document?
Do you want to go first, Jamie, or want me to go first?
Well, Mr. Sullivan, why don't you go ahead, because it was your requested relief and I can respond accordingly.
It was, and Erie's belief was that it would help enhance the enforcement of its BMPs to have them included in the COGCC's approval. Also, there is a BMP in the, it's the last one, it's number 31, I believe, which talks about that if there is a conflict between the Erie BMP and the COGCC's rules or conditions of approval, that the more stringent regulation would be the one that applies. Another piece of your question is directed to, are there, I think if I'm understanding it correctly, is directed to the issue of which BMPs in Erie are more stringent. Was I understanding that question correctly?
Well, let me pivot a bit. I mean, for instance, I'm looking at a slide for the BMPs for Erie, and one is around traffic and access roads. Well, I know darn well that Jason Maxey's got a traffic and access road BMP and or condition of approval or something. Have you and Mr. Maxey and or Crestone thought about, you know, how one complies with all? And then secondarily, the commission doesn't normally get into traffic and access. And is it appropriate for that to be on our 2A?
That is an example of a BMP that I think you're correct, that the commission would not address. And to the extent that particular traffic access BMP would apply, then that one would it would apply to roads in Erie only. And I'm not aware that Erie's done an analysis of which roads will be used, which roads within its jurisdiction will be used for access to this pad site. But since it is just north of the current municipal boundary and within the operator agreement area, my understanding is the town believes that that particular BMP would apply. And I don't know if David Frank can provide more information. He's actually in training for infrared camera and leak detection and all that sort of stuff. And so I don't know if he's available, but it's certainly something I could talk to him about, and we could provide more information tomorrow.
So I guess I'm going to challenge the panel this evening to do that little bit of a crosswalk like I talked about. I don't think that's fair for, you know, our staff or Julie's or Director Murphy's staff to have to sort of walk through 31 BMPs and try to figure out which ones are allowable to be put onto R2A. I mean, I'm just somewhat inclined that we ought not do that, or there's not a need to do that. And that's not to diminish the effectiveness of the BMPs. They're still part of a contractual agreement. But I might get a little more comfortable with it if I had someone be able to come talk to me tomorrow about how it is that this is not ending up clustering things and that they all work together really well, as opposed to potentially, you know, one saying you do this and another saying you do this, and then staff's trying to figure out which one's more protective and et cetera. So that's not a question. That's just a request. Ms. Jost?
Yes, Chair, thank you. And I guess if I could also just throw in a response from Crestone too. The reason I wanted Mr. Sullivan to kind of speak to this is because it is Erie's ask. And in the stipulation that was submitted to both Erie and the commission was that, you know, Crestone would agree to accommodate any decision by the commission to either include or not include those BMPs in the Form 2A, especially as they're outside of their jurisdiction. We understand the enforcement aspect here. And from our standpoint, the town of Erie's operator agreement fully allows for enforcement under that. So if Erie has the concern that there has been a violation under the operator agreement, then Erie full well has the right to seek an enforcement against Crestone under its OA. So I just was really hoping I could clarify that with respect to the stipulation and the request for the BMPs on the 2A. We support Erie's request if that's ultimately what the commission wants to do. But we did state in the stipulation that it was up to the commission's decision. The other thing too, Chair, is that Ms. Stearman is able to kind of provide the crosswalk. We have done that work. We're happy to have her present that now if you like, or based on what you just said, if you want us to come back with that tomorrow morning, we're more than happy to do that as well.
Well, why don't we let other commissioners ask questions, and then maybe we can get to that in the morning. I do have one final question, but Commissioner McGowan, if this is on the same topic.
I was just wondering, thank you, Mr. Chair, if there was anything that Erie requested that is outside of the operator agreement, or if everything is in the operator agreement, because then that would have to maybe be dealt with differently.
Commissioner McGowan, everything is in the operator agreement.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks for that clarification.
On the one clarification, there is a slight difference between Erie Exhibit A and Crestone Exhibit 12, I believe, in that there's an odor management plan in Erie's exhibit that isn't part of Crestone's exhibit. I think that was just an oversight that it wasn't included, but I don't think there's any disagreement that that odor management plan applies.
And Mr. Sullivan, that's correct, Chair, that is correct. It likely just wasn't attached to the submission of that exhibit. But your exhibit, we did stipulate to, we can just rely upon that with the inclusion of the odor management plan. Mr. Chair, I will also say that once we hit that point, Dr. McMullen and Dr. Hall do have 2 additional slides they would like to present to you as a response to your question for additional information on the slides that they may not have gotten to.
I figured they'd probably find a couple of good ones, so good for them. Let's have them pull their slide set back up and go over the 2 good ones.
Excellent, thank you. Give me a moment. Okay, Dr. Hall, I would happily turn it over to you.
Okay. So before I talk about this slide, I just want to explain to the commission that the data collected in the survey was very complex. There were a lot of symptoms asked, and they were asked at multiple frequency levels. So when you go to analyze that data, you end up with almost, it's an unwieldy type of results. And so the easiest ways to tackle these types of surveys is to simplify all of those questions into things like total symptoms, which I showed previously, and then also what Broomfield did, which was the Likert score. They're trying to simplify it down to kind of one measurement to look at. If you wanted exhibits of looking at it just at individual questions, we've done those because I wanted to look at it myself. And you see various patterns for every symptom. Some symptom you may see a little bit of a dose response just in the way people are responding, and some you see nothing. And so then when you aggregate these into groups, you're starting to influence the response patterns, and then it can artificially push something, artificially or not, depending on if the symptoms are related or not, it can artificially push it to significance. So we chose to look at it the way Broomfield did. We looked at it with total symptoms, and we also looked at it with their summed Likert score to match their analysis as closely as possible. And this slide here just takes the previous slide where I was looking at the total symptoms per setback group, and then it breaks them out into those least concerned and most concerned. And the least concern is on the left at the bottom x-axis, and the most concern is on the right. And then across the top, you will see the groupings, where to the far left is more than 2 miles away. In the middle, it's 1 to 2 miles away from well pad. And on the far right is within 1 mile. And I think it's pretty apparent there seems to be among the concerned an increased reporting of symptoms within 1 mile, where they're reporting on average 9 symptoms compared to roughly 7 symptoms for 1 to 2 miles and then 2 or more miles away. And then what's very interesting as well is the least concerned group has almost a decreased dose response, where those within 1 mile of the well pad are reporting 2.8 or 3 symptoms on average, compared to 4, 1 to 2 miles, and then 5, 2 or more miles away. This could be due to small sample size, and it could be real. There's a lot of explanations for it. It's just an interesting pattern to take note of at this point. We haven't done any additional statistical testing on this. This is just preliminary analysis to look at our data and try to characterize relationships. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. McMullen.
Thank you, Ms. Jost. I wanted to just share one slide here to really reiterate a couple of concepts that I would like to help explain to the commission. Broomfield is alleging that there's evidence that well pads that have similar BMPs to what's being proposed to the Coslet East well pad can emit hazardous air pollutants that are resulting in exposures likely to impact health of Broomfield residents. My concern with many of these allegations is not necessarily the lack of data per se, but based on what appears in the pre-hearing statements by Broomfield, it appears that they're drawing their conclusions based on a really small subset of their entire monitoring program data. And that subset of data, again, represent data that are on or near the well pads while neglecting to use the information that they're collecting in communities to understand public health impacts. Additionally, these 12 spikes that have been seen above guideline levels, for example, with benzene, it's important to remember that these are collected for 60-second timeframes, which, to my knowledge, I don't understand why that would be collected for a 60-second time frame if you want to understand public health impacts. So it just appears to me that maybe Broomfield is kind of interchanging their design of their study to use, maybe the study was designed such that it wanted to look at on-pad, potential for on-pad emissions and short changes in air quality, but are using those data that then extrapolate it to try to make sense of what it could mean to public health. And as a public health professional, I'm concerned about using data that weren't intended for the purposes exactly of assessing risk and using them to draw conclusions about health risks to people. There's standardized methodologies about how you collect exposure data accurately to ensure that we're doing the best job that we can to estimate exposures to people. And these data just don't represent that. So, just like I spoke about with the CTH study design, that study was designed specifically to answer questions about health risks to people. So before the commission, you have to really, it's thinking about two different concepts really that I think are getting kind of muddled. I mean, one is well pad, short-term changes in emissions right on the well pad. And then the second is, well, what does it mean to public health impacts? And I believe that the question here today is really driving home about what does it mean to public health impacts? And so as I shared earlier, Broomfield's extensive air monitoring program actually provides a lot of data about what it means to public health impacts that I showed to you, which are the data that are collected in the communities and that had not shown any impacts, both short and long term. So that's just a point I wanted to really kind of hit home with, because it was unusual to me to see. I've never seen that before with respect to using 1-minute measurements and then drawing conclusions around potential health impacts for longer timeframes. So thank you for the opportunity to get to share that.
Great, thank you very much for that additional information for our consideration. All right, I'm caught between a conundrum. Commissioner Messner is next, but Jason Maxey's raised his hand, but then he's not really with us. All right, Commissioner Messner, go ahead. Oh, there he is. Jason, did you have something?
Thank you, Chair Robbins. I'm trying to operate this while pulled off on the side of the road, trying to get to a good spot to where I can try to maybe ask a question if it's appropriate. I'd like to go back to the question about BMPs and your comment about who kind of has authority about what, if I may, because that raises a question on our end.
Sure, go for it. I've created a monster, but I think it was something we should talk about.
Well, I agree with you, Chair Robbins, and I think that at this point, Weld County has never seen an operator agreement between Crestone and the town of Erie. With all due respect to both parties, I understand Crestone is trying to do their best to work with and alleviate concerns on all fronts. However, our position when it gets down to it is that Weld County holds the land use authority over this location since it is in unincorporated Weld County. And I quite frankly would have the same concerns that you mentioned as far as what BMPs might be duplicative and who enforces what. We're dealing with approximate relevant government versus a relevant local government. and two permitting authorities, meaning Weld County and the COGCC, that has our own inspectors, our own BMPs, our own development standards and conditions of approval on our permits. And your question raised a very good question that, quite frankly, I have similar concerns with and have not been a part of the conversation about who would address what if and when any issues for this location arise.
Well, thank you for that comment, and I'm glad you pulled over and are not trying to drive at the same time as providing public comment. That's good for everyone. Why don't we do this? It's getting late in the day, and I know my other commissioners have a lot of questions. I have raised this issue, and what I would like is tomorrow, perhaps, kind of have an opportunity for a joint discussion on this issue, because I really do want to, sort of ferret it out. I want to get us to the right spot. And I don't know the answer tonight. And I don't know if you can join us again in the morning, Mr. Maxey, but we're reconvening at 9, I believe, and maybe we can take this up first thing before we go into the other cases in chief.
Sure. Thank you very much, Chair Robbins, just for that brief comment from some of the discussion I heard. I wanted to make that to let you know I still was listening as much as I could, and that we have a similar concern based on all the conversation. I probably have about an hour and a half in the morning, maybe, that I could join on. So I will do my best to be on at 9 to participate in any discussion that needs to be had.
Well, with the indulgence of my commissioners, I'm making this up as I'm going. I would like to possibly dive into that issue and only that issue at 9 for about 10 minutes, and then we can move on. And that can give everybody a chance to think about it this evening, including perhaps our staff. Okay, I will recognize Commissioner Messner, who I think was wanting to go next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thanks for bringing up that topic. That was top on my list as far as how to address. Erie initially was asking to be an additional relevant local government, which in our rules seems to be problematic as far as determining authority and enforcement. They were determined to be an affected person by the hearing officer, and I think we'll continue to hear more information about that. But I also think that I heard clearly that Crestone is willing to abide by Erie's operator agreement and to be held by the enforcement provisions within, independent of any kind of inclusion of those BMPs into our Form A. And I think that complexity with the relevant local government, which is Weld County in this particular situation, is important, particularly with their land use authority associated with a dual regulatory regime, which is what we have here within our rules, that independently allows the different relevant local government and the state to be able to address what they feel like they need to. And so I'm a little uncomfortable with trying to meld all these things together, but rather have them separate and enforceable. But that's just a comment, and so I appreciate you bringing it up. I also just want to just state that I appreciate Dr. McMullen's statements around tanks as a significant emission source in the reduction of tanks, and how that really can make a significant impact to air emissions. I think that's something that we've been contemplating for some time now. And Chair Robbins, you also asked a lot of my other questions, so I don't have a lot. I will reinforce, I think one of the statements that Commissioner McGowan talked about, which was, I think, this missed opportunity to have a no net adverse cumulative impacts associated to wells, particularly if there was 19 wells that were being contemplated at one point with an agreement with Broomfield, that based on the associated wells that are being proposed here would in a lot of ways be considered a no net adverse cumulative impact should that have moved forward. I also acknowledge that that's not a requirement at this point, but I think that was an opportunity there for sure. But those are the comments I have at this point, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Messner. Other commissioners with questions for the panel? Commissioner Cross and then Commissioner Ackerman, or vice versa, I don't care.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just have a few questions. First, I'll start with Ms. Stearman. As you talked about 2B, first I want to confirm that consistent with what was being talked about, the numbers do not include the plugging and abandonment. That's reductions, correct?
Thank you, Commissioner, for your question. That is correct.
Okay. And I know that Commissioner Messner and Commissioner McGowan were talking about that. I just wanted to make sure that in looking at this as a whole, what we're seeing is sort of an overestimate. And so consistent with that, I believe it was slides 44 and 45 of your presentation. The information provided is not the most up to date because of the reasons shown on those slides, correct? So there's the electrification is going to get rid of some of the NOx. Some of those numbers will be decreased because of, I think one of them said, a drilling generator is going to be removed as well, correct?
Commissioner, thank you. Yes, that is correct. And I think what's important to note is things do change over time. We do bring new technologies to the table. So yes, that would have been the best estimate at the time. But I think in addition to, I think there was some conversation about whether we underreport or overreport in general. If you don't have an emission source on a pad, you can't under or over report it. So I think those are some of the things we wanted to call out. But as we go more and more into resolving our true emissions, which is incredibly important for the company because we have ESG frameworks, we have commitments to be net zero. We are going to need to measure and be more accurate in our emissions reporting. So we call out a little bit that we are going to be refining more about how we know things run. So in other words, do they run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week? Those are the ways we've estimated emissions in the past. I think we're going to be doing a better job in the future.
Okay. Do you have an idea of how much lower some of the emissions that were provided in that Form 2B, how much lower they will be?
Thank you for the question. Yes, I can't roll that off my tongue. I can say for example, if you're looking at combustion emissions, there are going to be certain things that are going to decrease, like the NOx or like some of the greenhouse gases. As we eliminate venting, those are the things where we see the greenhouse gases and some of the VOCs decrease. As we resolve that out, we are going to be able to look at the Colorado emission inventory, which really will be a way to marry this up. That data is going to be reported by every industry into Colorado every year, and that'll be a way to resolve some of this.
And one similar question with it, you had also noted that the separator heaters are overestimated by assuming 100% runtime. For everyone's benefit, can you provide a more reasonable estimate of how often those will be running?
Yes, I can. This is a focus of a lot of interest right now because we are reporting some of these in our emission inventories. I do understand that when a well is new, we have hotter oil and the separator heaters don't run as often. We also have assumed higher conservative estimates for BTU, for example. We permit and we report to comply. So we're always looking at, where do we want to make sure that we're safe within some area of assumption. But as we move forward into how we collect data, that's going to be on our forefront to get a better understanding of when they do run and resolve this, because it affects how we report our greenhouse gas emissions and how we offset our emissions for the company.
Okay. And I guess sort of a way to summarize this line of questioning, and without putting words in your mouth, I believe Ms. Pranos in her opening had mentioned that it's possible that the emissions that you're suggesting are actually underestimated. Based on kind of what you showed in your presentation and the answers you've given here, would you say that the emissions you're showing are more, I don't want to say a worst case scenario, but are actually kind of like the high point of what you would expect absent some leak or something like that?
Thank you for the question. I'm familiar with what Ms. Pranos is referring to, and that is a concern amongst people who look at air emissions. And if you paint the industry with a broad brush and how we are trying to reconcile and verify our emissions, either through flyovers or through methane measurements, through Martinez Fund, voluntary programs, all these things are starting to resolve that. You cannot paint the Colorado DJ Basin brush with the same broad strokes that you can with all of these studies. That's one thing. And there is a new focus on, what are we missing in our emissions reporting? Are there maintenance activities? How are we reconciling some of that? Again, I point back to the emissions estimates and what's not on pad. Some of that is just simply not there. So there's nothing to over-report if we don't have an emission source. But just to add to that, we do in some cases use standard emission factors, which are just broadly accepted. And if that's the best that we have, then that's what we're going to report. But in many cases, we do site-specific sampling, and all of our emissions estimates that go into the 2B estimates are based on real experiences with samples and petroleum-based engineering models that truly report emissions as developed on the site.
Thank you for that. And maybe my next question is for Mr. Harrington. If this application was to be approved, when would you plan on beginning construction of the pad?
We'd begin in the first quarter of 2023.
Okay, and part of the reason I wanted to ask about that was in the same vein as Commissioner Robbins' comments in looking at the CDPHE BMPs that were suggested with relation to air. One of the ones you said no to was operator postponing construction activities on high ozone days. And I believe I heard Ms. Stearman testify that to a certain extent, construction activities availability, it's kind of what's available, what equipment's available at that time would play into what is used. But in terms of actual construction activities, I just wanted to try and make sure I understood that. And in quarter one, there likely wouldn't be high ozone days. And so I just wanted to try and make sure that I understood that, kind of separating what activities occur versus what activity or what equipment is available.
Thank you for that point. Yeah, the pad construction will take place in the winter and early spring, and we're unlikely to see ozone action days in that period.
And then I just have a couple questions for the doctors. First, Dr. McMullen, I just wanted to, towards the end of your presentation, you were going over the acute and the chronic experiences and kind of what was shown in the studies that CTH has done or CTE has done. And one of the things that you mentioned, and I just want to make sure I confirm this, is you said that in your study, it was only within 300 feet and only during drilling that you went over the chronic level. Is that correct?
That's right.
And that
Yes.
was not doing the 60-second, that was doing the 24-hour testing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. Sure. It's a good question, Commissioner Cross. It gets a little bit confusing when everybody collects data for different time frames, and then what do you compare it to, right? What's appropriate? So all of the studies that CTH have done, when it came to collecting measurements where we look at all those different compounds and compare them to health guidelines, which is what we call like a risk assessment, all of those we collected for 24 hours. And that has been a point I believe that Broomfield may have made in one of their pre-hearing statements as to a criticism of the 24-hour collection timeframe. However, it's really important to understand that the health guideline values, as you mentioned, chronic or acute, are all intended. So they're developed by toxicologists like myself, when I was like in industry or at the state. They're developed to compare to measurements that we collect for a specific duration, right? So basically the number for benzene, the 9 part per billion number that gets thrown around a lot, that is for short term, to protect against short-term symptoms, for example. However, the CDC, the Agency for Toxic Substance and Disease Registry, which is a part of CDC, when they developed that guideline number is actually intended to be protective to people up to 14 days of continuously being exposed. So not 60 seconds, not even 24 hours. So when we collect measurements at a 24-hour interval, it's actually one of the shorter timeframes, really, when it comes to looking at acute symptoms, especially with something like benzene. The reason we also collect at 24 hours is because we can do it continuously. So we do one can, and then we put another one out. So essentially, we've got ongoing continuous data for the lifetime of the work that we were doing. For example, on the Livingston well pad that we conducted work for extraction, we collected data for the entire phase of drilling to ensure that we weren't missing anything. And of that, only 2 of those samples were above that value, that chronic value, but that chronic value is intended to actually be protective for an exposure to somebody for their lifetime, if they were standing there breathing that air. So the reason I bring that up is because the numbers we use are really highly protective, but we do it for a reason. EPA says this is the way you screen out to really ensure if there's could be a potential risk or not. And if you do see something that goes above, for example, then maybe you need to look further and you need to put it into the appropriate context. That's also the last piece, is what I was just reiterating a little bit earlier, is that you have to ensure that the data are being appropriately contextualized. And it's not as easy as just, collect a sample and compare it to a number. So does that answer your question, Commissioner?
It does.
Okay, thank you.
And then the other question that I wanted to have for you, Dr. McMullen, was you mentioned that there was also and for clarity's sake, you had mentioned that there was a study done in 2014. Is the study you were referring to at the end also looking at 2014 drilling and production activities, or is that a separate study?
That's right. No, that is the same one. So, and I could go ahead and provide the commission with a link to that. It's actually publicly available on CDPHE's website on their oil and gas health program. So it was a pretty pivotal study at the time, because they wanted to know, similar to what you as the commission now have to implement with 181, is it was a study designed to try to do a generic model. So they use computer-based modeling to do estimates of what there could be as risks at different distances from some kind of generic well pad. So that, although the data that went into that model were actual data collected around well pads, a whole variety of different well pads. And that study was conducted by Colorado State University researchers that partnered with CDPHE. So the reason I bring that up is that everything that went into that model to generate those results came from data around emissions on well pads using best management practices that were back in 2014 and 15. It's not a criticism of the study. It's simply, as a researcher, I know how long it takes to generate data and to go through and to get all of that. But what it means is that we have to be really careful about using the results of that study and then applying it to today, right? So that's why it's important to understand what were the uncertainties, what were the assumptions used then. The big piece of that was, yes, there were times during drilling and times during flowback when they model those situations where the emissions were high enough to result in some kind of chemical concentration, up to maybe 2,000 feet away for some chemicals. I will say that when you really dig deep into the study done by Colorado State University, actually, I believe one of the highest emissions that could be driving that was actually an operation that had open tanks during flowback, which is not used at all right anymore. So does that answer your question? In fact, I will say that when I've been on extraction well pads on the pad during what they call is hybrid flowback, I hope, Ms. Stearman, I'm saying that correctly now, is completely different. I mean, I was hard pressed to even be able to detect 1 part per billion of all the volatile organic compounds anywhere on the pad.
Perfect. I appreciate that. And then
Yes.
one final question, and this is for Dr. Hall. And again, going back to Ms. Paranos's opening, I believe she said, and I apologize if I misstate this, I don't remember if she said it was the most comprehensive or the first of its kind self-reporting study. And so without going into all the details about some of the different criticisms you had of the self-reporting studies, I just kind of was wondering, to the extent this is the most comprehensive or it is the first of its kind, what are some of those criticisms based off of? Is it based off of any prior studies or kind of social work done in relation to self-reporting studies versus non-self-reporting studies, or kind of what are those conclusions based off of?
Are you referring to my conclusions in the direct?
Yes.
Yes. They're just based on epidemiological methods of designing studies. And my personal experience, I've designed several surveys, and I've worked on very large surveys like the BRFSS, PRAMS, Health Against Colorado. And there's particular ways that survey questions need to be designed so that you don't influence the respondent, so you can get accurate data. And this particular survey, when I was criticizing it, I was just applying survey 101 methods to this and lining up with where did they introduce bias into their questions or into analysis. Does that answer your question?
It does. I just wanted to make sure that we weren't missing any kind of, if there was reports on self-reporting studies like that.
There's a lot of literature out there about self-reporting symptom surveys and their potential biases. I can gather that for you if you're interested. I don't have it on hand right now. The studies that Ms. Paranos does refer to, there are studies that were done in Pennsylvania that were very similar to this one, except there's a major key points that they did not influence their participants in knowing what the study was for. So when they did their health survey, they were very clear that all they were doing is just tell me about your symptoms. They also picked symptoms that correlated more strongly with disease. And they asked questions about medical diagnoses. So if there's other ways to get it more valid symptoms, so I don't know if valid's the right word. It's difficult to ask someone about anxiety. I have anxiety this week about this hearing. If I was taking the survey today, I would answer yes to anxiety. So to me, that's not a very stable measurement to try to look at setbacks from oil and gas. So what you want to do is we want to look at the toxicology data on the health effects that could be caused from emissions coming from these oil and gas well pads. And then we want to ask questions about symptoms that would correlate to whatever that disease state would be if they were exposed to high levels of those chemicals. And this survey is just asking very non-specific questions, where the surveys done in Pennsylvania were asking more specific questions. Thank you for that question.
And I believe that's the only questions I have, Mr. Chair.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, I didn't hear your thoughts there. Did you pass it to me?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate that. And I just actually have one very short question for Mr. Sullivan. I appreciate the presentations today, very informative. And Mr. Sullivan, I just wanted to verify, I'm making an inference, and I think it's been stated that from Crestone that with the BMPs we've talked about, that the relief that Erie is being requested would be granted if they are somehow incorporated, yet to be determined exactly how we do that. And that Erie is acting, more as a partner than a protester in this hearing. And I just wanted to confirm directly with you, Erie's take on that, if you would.
Commissioner Ackerman, yes, I think that's accurate. Erie's just wanting to, get the enforcement it can get under the operator agreement. And yes, Erie and Crestone have been working well together in terms of exchanging information, allowing Erie to determine based on the information from Crestone that the BMPs will be met. And that's why we agreed to the stipulation that I mentioned in my remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. I appreciate that. I know a lot of work has gone into that, both from Erie and from Crestone. So I appreciate your comments. Mr. Chair, I'll cut off there. Thank you. That's all I have.
Okay, great. Looking around to see if anyone, Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to point out to the rest, for the record, that I get anxiety during these hearings as well. So that's all.
Excellent. Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess one last question for the doctors. What are some, so we've spent a lot of time picking apart the survey. Are there some things that we can gather and take away from this survey that are statistically significant or would pass peer review? Or, I think surveys do have some value and there's reasons that we do them. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what are some of the takeaways that we could take from the survey that Broomfield did.
Sure. Thank you for that question. I think the main point of this survey is that people are very concerned about oil and gas around their residence. And I think that provides an opportunity for us to educate the community and let them know that there are continuous air monitoring happening in your community. Let them know where monitoring is occurring. If the community feels like it's not enough, maybe you increase it. Educate them on what you're monitoring for and how that relates to potential health impacts. Let them know you have a plan. If something is detected, what is that plan? So they feel safe that if there is a detection, something's going to happen. And then also just educate them on the health impacts would not be expected at the levels that we're observing in the community. And then I just want to touch on, I think a lot of people are concerned about justice and cumulative impacts of multiple industries around. I think it's very important for, the nation as a whole to start educating on air monitoring data is capturing cumulative impacts from chemical emissions because it's capturing all of the different emitters in your community. And so I think there might be some fear that an additional facility coming in would just add to this risk, where we're just not seeing that when we look at air monitoring data. And then final point, Commissioner McGowan, I do think it's important to monitor health effects. I think CDPHE does a good job of monitoring health effects from the county level. I know there's other tools that could be used to get down to more granular levels, and even there's symptom monitoring systems out there that could be used. And that would be something that would help ease fears in the community or concern in the community.
Thank you.
All right, other final questions from commissioners? Ms. Larson, I'm going to call on you next, so if you could visualize. All right, seeing no further final comments. Ms. Larson, could you give the parties time allocations?
Yes, happy to do so. Let me pull up my spreadsheet. So Erie has 10 minutes and 11 seconds remaining. Crestone has 39 minutes and 45 seconds remaining. And Broomfield has 45 minutes and 55 seconds remaining.
be so advised parties. So with that, I think we will stop the hearing this afternoon. It is 5:55 and it has been a long day. Good work by everybody. We will start tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. I would like to start with that sort of BMP discussion. And again, I don't really have an answer here, but I just would task the parties with sort of thinking about it, and then we can see if we can get some perspective on where to go there. Following that, we will have the presentation in chief by Broomfield with cross and response, and then response presentation by Crestone with cross and response presentation by Broomfield, cross and response, closing statements all the way around, and then closing of the record and commissioner deliberation. And I just followed the script on the pre-hearing order, so I hope that y'all still agree with your pre-hearing order. So with that, I believe I'm looking for a motion to continue this matter to tomorrow morning, October 20th at 9 a.m.
So moved.
Second.
Motion by Commissioner Cross, second by Commissioner Ackerman. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? See you in the morning.